The winter Serafina Vale learned silence could be sharper than screaming was the night she stopped being a wife and became a weapon. She stood alone in this grand hall of Blackthorn Manor, watching frost creep across window panes like skeletal fingers, and understood with brutal clarity that the man she had married 3 years ago had never intended to love her. He had intended to use her. The realization didn't break her heart. It calcified it. What followed was not a story of rescue or redemption, but of a woman who discovered that survival sometimes requires becoming the very thing that once terrified you. Stay with me until the end, because what Serafina does next will redefine everything you think you know about revenge. The evening started like every other evening in that godforsaken house. Serafina sat in the drawing room, her posture perfect despite the screaming ache in her lower back from hours of maintaining appearances that nobody witnessed. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, casting shadows that made the portraits of dead Ashcrofts on the walls look like they were judging her. Maybe they were. Dead people seemed to have more presence in this manor than living ones. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that cost more than most families earned in a year, stitched by hands that would never touch such fabric themselves. The irony wasn't lost on her. Serafina had once believed that marrying Duke Damien Ashcroft meant ascending to a world of meaning, of purpose, of partnership. Instead, she had learned that wealth and title were just prettier words for loneliness. The clock on the mantel ticked past 9, then 10, then 11. Damien was late again. Not that late meant anything anymore. Late implied expectation, and Serafina had stopped expecting her husband to come home somewhere around month 14 of their marriage. She had stopped expecting conversation around month 8. She had stopped expecting basic human decency around month 3. Martha, the head housemaid, entered with a pot of tea that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes that had seen too much, and a mouth that knew when to stay shut, most of the time. "Your Grace," Martha said softly, setting the tray down, "perhaps you should retire for the evening." "Perhaps I should do many things," Serafina replied without looking at her. "But we rarely do what we should, do we?" Martha hesitated at the door. "The staff is saying—" "I don't care what the staff is saying." "With respect, Your Grace, you should care." Martha's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "They're saying the Duke is in the city, with Lady Cordelia Winters." There it was, the knife sliding between ribs with practiced precision. Serafina felt it, acknowledged it, and filed it away in the growing catalog of humiliations she had been collecting like other women collected jewelry. "Thank you, Martha. That will be all." "Your Grace, that will be all." Martha left, and Serafina was alone again with the dying fire and the judgmental dead people on the walls. She stood, moved to the window, pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, tiny white lies covering the ugliness of the world beneath. Lady Cordelia Winters. Of course. A widow with copper hair and a laugh like wind chimes who had appeared at court 6 months ago and immediately attached herself to Damien like a parasite that had found its perfect host. Serafina had watched it happen with the detached fascination of someone observing a play they had no power to stop. She had seen the way Cordelia touched Damien's arm during conversations, the way she laughed at things that weren't funny, the way Damien looked at her, actually looked at her, with something resembling interest in his cold gray eyes. Serafina had never inspired that look, not even on their wedding night, when she had been young and foolish enough to believe that intimacy could be built between two people who barely knew each other. Damien had performed his marital duties with the enthusiasm of a man filling out tax documents. Efficient, mechanical, forgettable. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it for just a moment. The humiliation, the rage, the crushing weight of being unwanted. Then she shoved it all down into that place inside herself where she kept everything she couldn't afford to acknowledge. That place was getting crowded. The clock struck midnight. Serafina went to bed alone, as she did every night, in a room that connected to Damien's through a door that was always locked from his side. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, and tried to remember what hope felt like. She couldn't. Watch. Dawn came gray and unforgiving. Serafina woke to voices outside her door. Urgent, hushed, the kind of whispers that meant everyone knew something she was supposed to pretend she didn't know. She dressed herself. It took longer without help, but she had started dismissing her lady's maid months ago, preferring solitude to the pity she saw in the girl's eyes. The gown she chose was simple, a dark blue wool that made her look older than her 26 years. Good. Maybe if she looked older, she would feel less like a naive girl who had walked into a trap with her eyes wide open. When she descended the stairs, the whispering stopped. Servants scattered like roaches when a light gets turned on. Serafina moved through the hall with her head high, her spine straight, her face a mask of aristocratic indifference. She had learned that mask well. It was perhaps the only useful thing her mother had taught her before dying of a fever when Serafina was 16. Never let them see you bleed, her mother had said. Blood only excites predators. Breakfast was a solitary affair in a dining room built for 20. Serafina sat at the head of the table, Damien's chair, but he wasn't there to object, and ate without tasting. Toast, eggs, tea that had gone bitter from oversteeping. Food was just fuel now, another mechanical function of a life that had become a series of mechanical functions. She was finishing her second cup of tea when Damien finally appeared. He looked terrible, which gave Serafina a small, vicious spark of satisfaction. His dark hair was disheveled, his cravat askew, his eyes bloodshot. He smelled of whiskey and perfume that wasn't hers, something floral and cloying that made Serafina's stomach turn. "You're still here," he said, as if her presence in her own home was somehow surprising. "Where else would I be?" Serafina kept her voice neutral, bored even. Damien poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly. "I assumed you'd still be asleep. You usually are." "I find sleep overrated these days." He sat down at the opposite end of the table, putting as much distance between them as the room would allow. For a few minutes, they existed in the same space without acknowledging each other, a talent they had both perfected. Then Damien spoke, and his voice carried that particular edge that meant he was about to say something cruel, because cruelty was easier than honesty. "I need you to attend the Pemberton Ball next week." Serafina set down her teacup carefully. "Why?" "Because you're my wife, and it looks bad when you don't appear." "It looks bad when you spend the night with your mistress, but that doesn't seem to stop you." The words were out before she could stop them, sharp and true and dangerous. Damien's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time in months, he actually looked at her. "Careful, Serafina." "Or what?" Something reckless was unfurling inside her, something that had been compressed too long. "You'll ignore me more than you already do? You'll humiliate me more publicly than you already have? Tell me, Damien, what exactly do I have to lose?" He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have everything to lose, your position, your title, your security. Or have you forgotten that all of this," he gestured around the room, "exists because of me?" "No," Serafina said quietly, standing as well. "I haven't forgotten. You remind me every day, in every way possible, that I am here by your grace and generosity. But grace implies kindness, Damien, and you stopped being kind to me approximately 5 minutes after we exchanged vows." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might actually engage, might actually have a real conversation with her for the first time in years. Instead, he turned toward the door. "You'll attend the ball. You'll smile. You'll play the devoted wife. That's what you're for." He left, and Serafina stood alone in the dining room, her hands trembling with rage she couldn't release. "That's what you're for." As if she were a piece of furniture, a decoration, a tool with a single function. She picked up her teacup and threw it against the wall, watching it shatter into 100 pieces. The sound was satisfying, brief but satisfying. Then she sat back down and finished her breakfast, because spite required energy. The day crawled forward with the excruciating slowness of something dying but not quite dead yet. Serafina spent the morning in the library, a room Damien never entered because reading required attention span and thought, two things he reserved exclusively for political scheming and seduction. She had claimed this space as her own, filled it with books that actually interested her rather than the leather-bound status symbols Damien collected. She was reading about property law, dry, tedious, but recently relevant for reasons she couldn't quite explain, when Martha knocked softly. "Your Grace, you have a visitor." Serafina looked up, surprised. She never had visitors. "Who?" Your brother, your grace, Lord Christopher Vale. Christopher. Relief and dread hit simultaneously. Her younger brother was the only family she had left, and seeing him always reminded her of better days, which made current days feel worse by comparison. Send him in. Christopher entered with the kind of energy that seemed impossible to maintain in Blackthorn Manor. He was 23, tall and rangy, with the same dark hair and sharp features Seraphina had inherited from their father. But where her eyes had gone dull from years of disappointment, his still held light. Sarah! He crossed the room and pulled her into a hug that she allowed for exactly 3 seconds before stepping back. What are you doing here, Kit? I heard things. Troubling things. He studied her face with concern that made her want to scream. About Damien and Lady Winters. Everyone's heard things. That's what happens when your husband is spectacularly unsubtle about his affairs. Christopher's expression darkened. This isn't acceptable. I'll talk to him. No. Seraphina cut him off sharply. You'll do nothing. It will only make things worse. How could it possibly be worse? Trust me, Kit. It can always be worse. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Christopher had always been protective, always believed that problems could be solved through direct confrontation. He didn't understand yet that some problems had no solutions, only survival strategies. You could leave him, Christopher said quietly. Come back to Vale House. We'll figure something out. And live on what? The generosity of distant relatives who barely tolerated father when he was alive? The meager inheritance that barely keeps Vale House from falling apart? Seraphina shook her head. I'm trapped, Kit. I made a choice 3 years ago, and now I have to live with it. That's not... It is. It's exactly how it works. Women don't get to unmake choices. We get to endure them. Christopher looked at her with something that might have been pity, and Seraphina hated it. She didn't want pity. She wanted nothing, which was convenient because nothing was exactly what she had. They talked for another hour, carefully avoiding every topic that mattered. Christopher told her about his work at the Royal Archives, a position that paid poorly but satisfied his love of dusty documents and forgotten history. Seraphina pretended to be interested, asked the right questions, made the right sounds. It was exhausting. When he finally left, promising to visit again soon, Seraphina felt hollower than before. Seeing Christopher was like looking through a window at a life she could have had if she had made different choices, if she had been less naive, if she had understood that love was a luxury poor aristocrats couldn't afford. But 3 days later, everything changed. Seraphina had developed a habit of sleeplessness, wandering the manor at night when the servants were asleep and the house belonged only to ghosts and unwanted wives. On this particular night, she found herself in Damien's study, a room she had been implicitly forbidden from entering despite no explicit prohibition ever being stated. She told herself she was looking for a book she had seen him carrying once, some treatise on political theory she wanted to read. That was a lie. She was looking for something, anything, that might explain why her life had become this particular nightmare. The study was exactly what she expected, all dark wood and leather, with maps on the walls and papers stacked on the desk in the organized chaos of a man who believed his own system was the only system. Seraphina lit a single candle, not wanting to attract attention, and began searching. Most of the papers were boring. Contracts for land purchases, correspondence with other nobles about parliamentary votes, bills from tailors and wine merchants that cost more than most families earned in 6 months, evidence of a life lived in excess by a man who had never known want. Then she found the document. It was tucked in a drawer, not hidden exactly, but not displayed either. A legal contract written in the dense language lawyers use to obscure meaning while claiming clarity. Seraphina had to read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. It was a petition to dissolve their marriage, drafted but not yet filed. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the section detailing asset division. According to this document, if their marriage ended, Seraphina would receive nothing. Not the standard widow's portion, not the settlements that had been promised in their marriage contract, nothing. She read further, her hands beginning to shake. The document argued that Seraphina's inheritance from her father, Vale House, and the small estate that came with it should be forfeit to the Ashcroft holdings because of some obscure legal technicality about marital property and debt assumption. It was theft, dressed up in legal language, but theft nonetheless. and it was dated 2 weeks ago. Serafina sat down heavily, the paper still in her hands. 2 weeks. Damien had been planning this for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. While she had been sitting in drawing rooms waiting for him to come home, while she had been enduring whispers and pitying looks, while she had been teaching herself to expect nothing and survive on less, he had been methodically planning to destroy what little she had left. The rage that flooded through her was so pure, so complete, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. It wasn't the hot rage of impulse, the kind that leads to thrown teacups and slammed doors. It was cold, calculated, the kind of rage that builds glaciers and carves canyons. She carefully returned the document to exactly where she had found it. Then she stood, blew out the candle, and walked back to her room with purpose in her stride for the first time in 3 years. Damien wanted to take everything from her? Fine. She would burn his entire world to ash first. The next morning, Serafina did something she hadn't done in months. She smiled at breakfast. Damien, nursing what was clearly a brutal hangover, looked at her with suspicion. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," Serafina said lightly, buttering her toast with deliberate care. "Can't a wife be pleasant to her husband?" "You're never pleasant. Then consider this a new leaf turning." He studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and returned to his coffee. Serafina had learned early in their marriage that Damien only paid attention to things that directly affected him. If she wasn't crying or causing a scene, she simply didn't register. That was going to be his first mistake. After breakfast, Serafina went to her room and began taking inventory. She needed to understand exactly what she had, what she could leverage, and what she was willing to sacrifice. The list was depressingly short. Assets. A modest amount of jewelry, mostly gifts from her mother and grandmother. The deed to Vale House, currently held in trust but technically hers. A few £1,000s in a personal account Damien didn't know about, saved slowly over 3 years from the household allowance he gave her. Her education, which included fluency in 3 languages, and a surprisingly comprehensive understanding of political history. Liabilities. No social power of her own, all of it borrowed from Damien's title. No allies among the nobility, who had watched her being humiliated and chosen to look away. No legal standing as a woman in a society that treated wives as property. And most critically, no proof of whatever scheme Damien was running, because she was certain now that the document she had found was just the surface. Men like Damien didn't destroy wives simply for convenience. They destroyed wives to hide something worse. Serafina needed information, she needed allies, and she needed to be very, very careful, because if Damien suspected she was planning anything, he would act first. She thought about Christopher, immediately dismissed it. Her brother was too honest, too straightforward. He would try to help by confronting Damien directly, and that would be disastrous. She thought about Martha, considered it. The head housemaid had been kind, had tried to warn her. But servants talked, and anything Serafina said to Martha would spread through the staff like wildfire. No. She needed someone outside this house, outside this world of aristocratic games and social climbing. She needed someone who understood power from the outside looking in. The thought that came next was so unlikely, so potentially catastrophic, that Serafina almost dismissed it immediately. But then she remembered something her father had told her once, when she was young, and asking why he bothered being nice to people who couldn't help him advance socially. "Power isn't just about who's above you, Sarah," he had said. "It's about who's beside you and below you. The people who actually do the work, who actually know the secrets, who actually move the pieces while the nobility pretends to play the game." Serafina went to find Martha. Bandek. She found the housemaid in the linen closet, taking inventory of sheets that cost more than she earned in a year. Martha looked up, startled to see Serafina in the servants' area of the house. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" "Close the door," Serafina said quietly. Martha hesitated, then did as asked. They were alone in the small space, surrounded by perfectly folded white linen that smelled of lavender and lies. "I need information," Serafina said without preamble, "and I need your discretion." Martha's expression shuddered. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Grace." "Yes, you are. You know everything that happens in this house. You know where Damien goes, who he sees, what he does when he thinks nobody's watching. I need you to tell me." With respect, Your Grace, asking me to spy on my employer. He's my employer, too, Serafina cut her off. And he's planning to destroy me. I found documents, Martha. Legal papers that would strip me of everything my father left me. So I'm not asking you to betray him out of spite or jealousy. I'm asking you to help me survive. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her kind eyes searching Serafina's face. What do you want to know? Relief flooded through Serafina, so intense it was almost painful. Everything. Start with Lady Winters. What Martha told her over the next hour was worse than Serafina had imagined. Lady Winters wasn't just a mistress. She was a tool, a pretty face used to distract while Damien conducted business that couldn't bear scrutiny. Over the past 6 months, while everyone gossiped about the affair, Damien had been meeting with a group of nobles and merchants who were involved in something Martha couldn't quite articulate but knew was dangerous. They meet at the Ivory Club, Martha said, every Thursday evening. The Duke thinks nobody notices because everyone's watching him with Lady Winters, but my nephew works in the kitchens there. He says there are private rooms in the back, and what happens in those rooms isn't about wine and cards. What is it about? Money, land, power, the things men will destroy each other over. Martha paused. My nephew says there was talk about estates being seized, about families losing their homes, about contracts that weren't legal but looked legal enough to fool people who couldn't afford lawyers. Serafina felt the pieces starting to arrange themselves into a picture she didn't like. Names. I need names. Martha gave her 3. Lord Edmund Ashford, a minor noble with gambling debts and loose morals. Merchant Samuel Carver, who had made his fortune in shipping and was rumored to have connections to smuggling operations. And Sir Victor Thornwood, a lawyer who specialized in property law and had a reputation for finding loopholes that shouldn't exist. There are others, Martha added, but these 3 are the ones who visit the manor when they think nobody's paying attention. Serafina committed everything to memory, her mind already working through possibilities. This was bigger than a humiliating divorce. This was corruption, possibly criminal, and if she could prove it, if she could gather evidence. She looked at Martha. Thank you. And Martha? This conversation never happened. What conversation? Martha asked, her expression neutral. I've been counting sheets all morning. That afternoon, Serafina did something else she hadn't done in months. She left the manor. She had forgotten what it felt like to move through the world without asking permission first. The city was cold and gray under winter clouds, but it felt more alive than Blackthorn Manor had in 3 years. People rushed past on important errands, vendors called out their wares, horses clopped on cobblestones. Life, happening all around her, indifferent to her private catastrophes. She had told the driver to take her to the commercial district, claiming she needed to shop for the upcoming ball. Instead, she went to Vale House. The house her father had left her was modest by aristocratic standards, a 3-story building in a neighborhood that had been fashionable 30 years ago and was now just respectable. Serafina hadn't visited in over a year, letting it sit empty rather than rent it out because Damien had always dismissed it as worthless. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Hendricks, who had served her father, seemed shocked to see her. Lady, forgive me, Your Grace, I wasn't expecting you. I should visit more often, Serafina said, stepping into the entrance hall. How is the house? Well enough, Your Grace. A few repairs needed, but nothing urgent. Serafina walked through rooms that smelled of dust and memory. This was where she had grown up, where her father had taught her to read, and her mother had taught her to be invisible, where Christopher had broken a vase playing with a ball indoors, and she had taken the blame because she was older and should have been watching him, where she had learned that love and safety were fragile things that could be destroyed by something as simple as a fever. In her father's study, she found what she was looking for: his papers, his correspondence, his careful records of every business dealing and family connection he had maintained. Her father had been methodical to the point of obsession, writing everything down because he never trusted memory. She spent 3 hours reading through documents, looking for anything that might help her. What she found was a detailed accounting of the financial arrangement that had preceded her marriage to Damien. Her father had been in debt. Serious debt, the kind that would have meant losing Vale House and everything else. Damien had offered to assume those debts in exchange for marriage to Serafina, along with a promise to maintain the Vale family reputation. It was a rescue, or it had been framed as a rescue. But reading through her father's increasingly desperate letters to various creditors, Serafina saw something else. A man being pushed into a corner by carefully coordinated pressure. Bills called in early, loans suddenly due, business relationships dissolving for no clear reason. Someone had been deliberately destroying her father financially, and whoever it was had known exactly how much pressure to apply before offering a solution. Serafina sat back, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Damien hadn't married her because he wanted a wife. He had married her because he wanted Vale House and the small but strategically located estate it represented. The marriage wasn't a rescue, it was a hostile acquisition disguised as romance. And now that he had secured whatever he needed from the arrangement, he was getting rid of her and taking the property anyway. She wanted to scream. Instead, she carefully gathered every document that might be useful, thanked Mr. Hendricks, and returned to the carriage with her arms full of her father's organized paranoia. The Pemberton ball arrived with all the inevitability of winter frost. Serafina dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep wine red that made her skin look like porcelain and her dark hair shine like polished wood. Her lady's maid had been shocked when Serafina summoned her for the first time in months, but had said nothing, just styled hair and laced corsets with professional efficiency. When Serafina descended the main staircase, Damien was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked handsome in his evening clothes, the kind of handsome that had made her believe in fairy tales 3 years ago. Now she saw it for what it was, a pleasant arrangement of features that disguised something rotten underneath. "You look acceptable," Damien said, which was his version of a compliment. "How generous of you to notice." They traveled to the Pemberton estate in hostile silence, sitting on opposite sides of the carriage like enemies under a temporary truce. Serafina watched the city pass by through the window and thought about all the ways this evening could go wrong. She was walking into a room full of people who had watched her be humiliated and had done nothing, who had gossiped about her husband's affairs and pitied her while secretly being glad they weren't her. The Pemberton ballroom was excessive, even by aristocratic standards. All gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, and enough candles to light a small village for a year. The noble families of the kingdom had turned out in force, dressed in silks and jewels that represented more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime. Serafina felt eyes turn toward her as she entered on Damien's arm, felt the whispers start like a wave. The Duchess finally emerges. "Look how composed she is." "Poor thing. Do you think she knows about Cordelia?" "Of course she knows. Everyone knows." She kept her head high and her expression neutral, the mask she had perfected slipping into place. This was a performance, and she was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. Damien abandoned her almost immediately, gravitating toward a cluster of men that included Lord Ashford and Sir Thornwood. Serafina watched him go without protest. She had her own agenda tonight. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant and began to circulate, greeting people with the right amount of warmth and distance. The wives of various nobles received her with varying degrees of genuine kindness and performative sympathy. Serafina smiled and made appropriate responses and revealed absolutely nothing. Then she saw Lady Cordelia Winters across the room, and something cold and focused settled in her chest. Cordelia was beautiful in that obvious way that men found irresistible and women found threatening. She wore a gown of pale gold that probably cost more than Serafina's entire wardrobe, and she was laughing at something one of her admirers had said, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Not Damien's arm, interestingly. Lord Edmund Ashford's arm. Serafina filed that detail away and kept moving, kept watching. She was looking for something specific tonight, though she couldn't have articulated what. A crack in the facade. A thread she could pull. Anything. She found it in the most unlikely place. There was a man standing alone near one of the tall windows, watching the crowd with the kind of detached attention that suggested he was working rather than enjoying himself. He was in his early 30s, with sharp features and dark eyes that missed nothing. His evening clothes were well made but not extravagant, suggesting someone who had status but not necessarily wealth. Serafina had learned to pay attention to people who paid attention. This man was cataloging everything in the room with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to gather information. She approached him with her most disarming smile. "You look as miserable as I feel." He turned those sharp eyes on her, surprise flickering across his face before he caught himself. Your Grace, I didn't mean to appear miserable. My apologies. Don't apologize for honesty. It's refreshing. She studied him more openly. I don't think we've been introduced. Nathaniel Crowe. He inclined his head slightly. Investigator for the Crown. And you are Her Grace the Duchess of Ashcroft, though I suspect you find that title more burden than blessing at the moment. The bluntness shocked her into genuine laughter. You're either very perceptive or very rude. Both, usually. It's a professional hazard. Serafina liked him immediately, which was dangerous. She hadn't liked anyone in a very long time. What brings a Crown investigator to a social gathering? I doubt you're here for the champagne. The same thing that brings predators to watering holes. I'm watching people who need watching. Anyone I know? His expression shifted, became carefully neutral. Your husband among them. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications. Serafina felt her heart rate pick up. This was either an extraordinary opportunity or a catastrophic trap. She needed to know which. If you're investigating Damien, you're not doing it very subtly. Standing alone and watching everyone tends to draw attention. Maybe I want to draw attention. Maybe I'm waiting for someone to approach me who has reason to be interested. Someone like me? Someone exactly like you. Serafina took a sip of champagne to buy herself time to think. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that Crown investigators couldn't be trusted, that she was one word away from disaster. But another part of her, the part that had been compressed and ignored for 3 years, recognized opportunity when she saw it. What exactly do you think I know? She asked carefully. I think you're married to a man involved in activities that would interest the Crown. I think you're smarter than he gives you credit for. And I think you've been paying attention, even when everyone assumed you were just a decorative wife, too heartbroken to notice the world around her. The description stung because it was exactly what she had been pretending to be. And if I knew something, why would I tell you? Because knowledge without power is just frustration, and I'm offering you power. Nathaniel Crowe leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping. I've been investigating a network of corruption involving stolen estates, forged contracts, and political manipulation. Your husband is connected to at least 6 families who have been systematically destroyed over the past 5 years. If you help me prove it, I can help you escape it. Serafina's mind raced. 6 families. 5 years. That was longer than her marriage. Damien had been doing this before he ever met her, before he trapped her father with debt, before he made her complicit through marriage. I would need guarantees, she said quietly. I won't risk everything only to find myself abandoned when it becomes inconvenient. I can't promise this will be easy or safe. I can promise that if you help me bring him down, you won't go down with him. The Crown protects its sources. Sources? The word tasted bitter. Is that what I would be? You would be someone who refused to let corruption continue when she had the power to stop it. Some people might call that heroic. I'm not a hero, Mr. Crowe. I'm a wife who wants to survive her marriage. Sometimes survival is the most heroic thing we can manage. Before Serafina could respond, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Damien approaching with Lord Ashford and Sir Thornwood flanking him like bodyguards. Serafina, Damien said coldly, I've been looking for you. You're neglecting your duties as hostess. I'm not the hostess. Lady Pemberton is the hostess. I'm just a guest. Damien's jaw tightened. Come with me. Now. She glanced at Nathaniel Crowe, who had shifted into perfect professional neutrality, then back at her husband. Of course, darling. Whatever you say. The sarcasm was subtle enough that only Damien would catch it. His hand closed around her arm, not quite rough enough to cause a scene, but firm enough to communicate his anger. He led her away from Nathaniel Crowe, away from the crowd, into a side room that was blissfully empty. What the hell do you think you're doing? Damien demanded, releasing her arm. Having a conversation. Is that forbidden now? Do you have any idea who that man is? A Crown investigator, apparently. He was quite forthcoming. Damien's face went pale, then flushed with rage. Stay away from him. Why? If you have nothing to hide. I'm serious, Serafina. Stay away from him, or there will be consequences. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw fear underneath the anger. Good. Let him be afraid. He had made her afraid for 3 years. "Don't threaten me, Damien. I'm done being threatened." She turned to leave, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip hard enough to hurt. "You don't get to be done. You're my wife. That means you do what I tell you, when I tell you. Understood?" Serafina looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Something had shifted inside her, some fundamental structure that had been holding her together through years of humiliation. It didn't crack. It didn't break. It simply rearranged itself into something new. "Take your hand off me," she said quietly, "before I scream loud enough that everyone in that ballroom hears me." He released her, shocked. Serafina had never fought back before. She had never threatened him. She had been the perfect victim, absorbing everything he threw at her with silent endurance. "You've changed," he said, and it sounded like an accusation. "No," Serafina replied. "I've just stopped pretending." She walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, and returned to the ballroom with her head high and her heart pounding. She found Nathaniel Crowe still standing by the window, still watching everything. She walked past him without stopping, but as she did, she spoke quietly enough that only he would hear. "Vale House, tomorrow morning. Come alone." She didn't wait for his response, just kept walking, kept smiling, kept performing the role of Duchess while inside she was already planning the systematic destruction of everything Damien had built. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of false conversations and forced laughter. Serafina danced when expected, smiled when appropriate, and played the role so perfectly that by the time she and Damien returned to Blackthorn Manor, no one suspected that the decorative wife had just declared war. In her room, alone again, Serafina stood at the window and watched snow begin to fall. Her wrist ached where Damien had grabbed her. Tomorrow, there would be bruises, visible evidence of things usually kept hidden. Let there be bruises. Let them be proof. She had spent 3 years being silent, being careful, being the perfect victim. But silence hadn't protected her. Careful hadn't saved her. Perfect had only taught Damien that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. Tomorrow, she would meet with a crown investigator and betray her husband. Tomorrow, she would start gathering evidence that could destroy the man who had destroyed her. Tomorrow, she would stop being a victim and become something far more dangerous. But tonight, she was still just a woman alone in a cold house, watching snow cover the world in white lies, and trying to remember who she had been before this marriage taught her that survival sometimes requires becoming unrecognizable. The clock struck 2, 3, 4. Dawn came gray and unforgiving, and with it, the beginning of the end. Nathaniel Crowe arrived at Vale House exactly at dawn, when the city was still gray and half asleep. Serafina watched him from the window as he approached on foot. No carriage, no attendants, exactly as she had requested. He moved with the careful awareness of someone who understood that being noticed could be fatal. She opened the door herself before he could knock. Mr. Hendricks had been sent away with instructions not to return until afternoon. This conversation required absolute privacy. "Your Grace," Nathaniel said, stepping inside quickly. His eyes swept the entrance hall, cataloging exits and potential threats with the automatic efficiency of a man who had survived by being paranoid. "Just Serafina. Titles feel absurd when we're discussing treason." "We're not discussing treason. We're discussing justice. Men in power rarely see the difference." She led him to her father's study, the room that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. The documents she had gathered were spread across the desk in careful arrangement. 3 years of collected humiliation, organized into evidence. Nathaniel approached the desk slowly, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine surprise as he began reading. Serafina watched him work, noting the way his eyes moved across pages, the small movements of his hands as he cross-referenced dates and names, the tension in his shoulders when he found something particularly damning. After 20 minutes of silence, he looked up at her. "This is more than I expected. Much more." His voice carried a weight that might have been respect. "How long have you been gathering this?" "I only started yesterday. Most of this belonged to my father. He documented everything, probably because he knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what." Nathaniel picked up a letter dated 4 years ago from one of her father's creditors demanding immediate payment. "Your father was pressured into debt deliberately. These demands were coordinated." "I know. Damien engineered my father's financial collapse so he could swoop in as a savior. The marriage wasn't romance, it was acquisition. And you figured this out when? 2 days ago, when I found documents in Damien's study showing he planned to divorce me and seize my inheritance. Serafina moved to stand beside him, pointing to specific letters. But this goes deeper than one man's greed. My father had correspondence with at least 3 other families who were experiencing similar financial catastrophes. Lord Pemberton, whose estate borders mine. The Ashford family before they sold everything to cover Edmund's gambling debts. The Winters family before Cordelia was widowed and left with nothing. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Cordelia Winters is part of this? I think she's a victim who became a tool. Her husband died in suspicious circumstances 3 years ago, leaving her dependent on Damien's patronage. Now she distracts people while he conducts business that can't survive scrutiny. You're suggesting a pattern of deliberate destruction spanning years. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm showing you evidence. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through implications and connections. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. If I pursue this investigation, you will be exposed. Damien will know you betrayed him, and he will retaliate viciously. He's already planning to destroy me. At least this way I'll take him down first. You understand what you're asking for? This won't be a clean legal proceeding. Men like your husband don't go quietly. They fight, and they fight dirty. Serafina thought about 3 years of silence, 3 years of being invisible in her own home, 3 years of teaching herself that wanting anything was dangerous because wanting led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the kind of pain that made breathing difficult. I spent 3 years of being afraid of what Damien might do if I fought back, she said quietly. I'm more afraid of what I'll become if I don't. Nathaniel studied her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. You've changed since last night. Something happened. He grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise when I talked to you. Then he threatened me, said there would be consequences if I didn't obey. She pulled back her sleeve, showing the dark marks that had bloomed overnight like poisonous flowers. I realized that I've been waiting for him to stop hurting me, as if patience and compliance would eventually earn me basic human decency. But men like Damien don't stop because you're good. They stop when you make them stop. And you're ready to make him stop? I'm ready to burn his entire world down and dance in the ashes. The viciousness in her own voice startled her. She had been raised to be gentle, diplomatic, soft-spoken. Ladies didn't express rage. Ladies certainly didn't threaten violence, even metaphorical violence. But 3 years of swallowing anger had transformed it into something cold and purposeful that felt more honest than anything she had said in years. Nathaniel smiled slightly. Then let's burn it down together. Check. They spent the next 4 hours building a case. Nathaniel explained what he already knew from his investigation. A network of corrupt officials and desperate nobles working together to manipulate property laws, forge documents, and systematically steal from families too vulnerable to fight back. The profits were enormous. The victims were chosen carefully. People with enough assets to be worth stealing, but not enough power to resist. The problem is proof, Nathaniel said, spreading out his own documents alongside Serafina's. I can show a pattern of suspicious land transfers and financial collapses. I can demonstrate connections between the key players, but what I need is direct evidence of conspiracy, documents showing coordination, testimony from someone inside the operation. You need someone to confess, preferably someone who's terrified enough of prosecution to betray his associates. Serafina thought through the list of names Martha had given her. Lord Edmund Ashford was weak-willed and desperate. Samuel Carver was pragmatic and self-interested. Sir Victor Thornwood was clever and cautious. Which one would break first under pressure? Ashford, she said. He's drowning in debt and probably terrified that Damien will abandon him. If you can offer him immunity in exchange for testimony, he'll take it. What makes you so sure? Because I've watched him at social gatherings for 3 years. He drinks too much and talks too much and always looks like he's one bad day away from complete collapse. Men like that don't have loyalty. They have survival instinct. Nathaniel made notes, his expression thoughtful. Getting to Ashford without alerting your husband will be difficult. They're close associates. Leave that to me. I can get you access. How? Serafina smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. By being exactly what everyone expects me to be. A desperate wife trying to save her marriage by hosting a dinner party where her husband can conduct business among friends. The next week passed in careful choreography. Serafina played her role perfectly, the devoted wife trying to restore domestic harmony through social obligation. She suggested the dinner party to Damien as if the idea had just occurred to her, framing it as an opportunity for him to strengthen political alliances in a private setting. Damien was suspicious at first, but Serafina had learned over 3 years exactly how to manipulate him. She made herself small and apologetic. She implied that she understood her behavior at the Pemberton ball had been inappropriate and wanted to make amends. She stroked his ego by suggesting that his associates would benefit from seeing his perfectly managed household. "You're trying very hard suddenly," Damien said, studying her across the breakfast table. "I'm trying to be a good wife. Isn't that what you've always wanted? What I want is for you to stay out of my business and stop asking questions that don't concern you." "Then let me help you by creating the perfect environment for your business. That's what wives are for, isn't it?" She let just enough bitterness seep into her voice to make it sound authentic. Making life easier for their husbands? Damien considered this, his cold gray eyes searching for deception and finding only the broken woman he expected to see. "Fine. Arrange it. But keep it small. Ashford, Carver, Thornwood, and their wives if they must. And Serafina, no more conversations with Crown investigators." "Of course not, darling. That would be terribly inappropriate." She hated how easily the lies came now. She hated that 3 years of marriage had taught her to manipulate and deceive with the same casual cruelty Damien wielded. But survival required adaptation, and she was adapting rapidly. The dinner party was scheduled for Thursday evening. Serafina spent the intervening days making arrangements that appeared domestic but were actually tactical. She met with Nathaniel twice more at Vale House, coordinating timing and strategy. She confirmed with Martha that her nephew at the Ivory Club could provide additional testimony about the Thursday meetings. She wrote everything down in cipher, using a code her father had taught her when she was young, just in case. Christopher visited once, concerned about rumors he had heard regarding her marriage. Serafina deflected his questions with practiced ease, assuring him everything was fine while carefully avoiding any actual lies. Her brother had always been terrible at deception. If he knew what she was planning, he would either try to stop her or inadvertently give her away. "You seem different," Christopher said as he was leaving. "I can't explain it, but you seem tired? I haven't been sleeping well." "No, you seem focused, like you've decided something." Serafina kissed his cheek gently. "I've decided to stop waiting for my life to get better and start making it better. Is that so strange?" "From you?" "Yes." But he smiled when he said it, and Serafina felt a pang of guilt for lying to him. The guilt passed quickly. She was becoming very good at making feelings pass quickly. Thursday arrived with perfect timing. The weather turned bitter cold, giving everyone excuse to arrive early and stay late. Serafina had arranged everything meticulously. The menu designed to encourage drinking, the seating that would isolate Ashford from his allies, the subtle ways she could create opportunities for private conversation. The guests arrived promptly at 7. Lord Edmund Ashford came with his wife Eleanor, a pale woman who looked perpetually worried. Samuel Carver arrived alone, his wife apparently ill, though Serafina suspected illness was a convenient fiction to avoid social obligation. Sir Victor Thornwood brought his young wife Cecilia, a woman half his age who spent most social gatherings looking bored. Damien played the gracious host with the easy confidence of someone who believed he controlled everything in his domain. Serafina played the dutiful hostess, ensuring drinks stayed full and conversation stayed light. During dinner, she watched the dynamics carefully. Damien sat at the head of the table, naturally commanding attention. Thornwood was watchful and controlled, revealing nothing. Carver was pragmatic, steering conversation toward profitable topics. And Ashford was exactly what she expected. Nervous, drinking too much, constantly seeking approval from Damien. After dinner, the men retired to Damien's study for brandy and business, as Serafina had known they would. The wives remained in the drawing room making stilted conversation about fashion and weather and all the meaningless topics women were expected to find fascinating. Serafina let the conversation drift for 20 minutes, then excused herself with a smile. "I need to check with the kitchen about dessert. Eleanor, would you join me? I'd love your advice on a recipe." Eleanor Ashford looked surprised, but followed obediently. Serafina led her not to the kitchen, but to a small parlor on the ground floor, far from where the men were conducting business. Your Grace, I'm not sure Please sit, Eleanor. I need to talk to you about your husband. Eleanor's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Edmund is involved in something dangerous, and it's going to destroy your family if someone doesn't intervene. We can't. Eleanor was trembling now, her hands twisted together in her lap. Please don't ask me to betray my husband. Serafina sat beside her, softening her voice. I'm not asking you to betray him. I'm asking you to save him. The Crown is investigating a conspiracy involving stolen property and forged documents. Edmund is implicated. If he cooperates, he can receive immunity. If he doesn't, he'll go down with everyone else. How do you know this? Because I've been gathering evidence. Because I've been working with a Crown investigator. Because I'm trying to escape the same trap your husband helped build. Serafina took Eleanor's shaking hands. My husband planned to destroy me legally. Yours is about to be destroyed criminally. We can help each other. Edmund would never agree. Edmund is terrified. I've watched him for 3 years. He's drowning in debt, desperate for approval, constantly afraid that Damien will abandon him. If you give him permission to save himself, he'll take it. Eleanor was crying now, silent tears that spoke of years of worry and fear. What do you need from us? Testimony, documents, everything Edmund knows about the conspiracy. In exchange, the Crown will offer immunity from prosecution and protection from retaliation. When? Tomorrow. There's a Crown investigator named Nathaniel Crowe. He'll meet with Edmund at Vale House at noon. Tell your husband that his choices are simple: cooperate and survive, or stay loyal to Damien and face prosecution. Eleanor nodded, still crying. Will it really protect him? It's the only thing that will protect him. They returned to the drawing room separately. Serafina made her excuses about the dessert taking longer than expected. Eleanor sat quietly in the corner, her face composed but her hands still shaking. The other wives noticed nothing, too absorbed in their own meaningless conversations. When the men finally emerged from Damien's study, they were in good spirits. Whatever business they had conducted had apparently gone well. Serafina served dessert with a smile, poured coffee with steady hands, and played the perfect hostess until the last guest had departed. Damien was in an unusually good mood as they prepared for bed. That went well, he said, actually addressing her directly for once. Thornwood agreed to the Pemberton contract. Carver's ships will handle the transport. Everything's falling into place. I'm glad I could help facilitate it. He looked at her with something that might have been approval if it had contained any warmth. You can be useful when you remember your place. Serafina smiled and said nothing. Let him think she had remembered her place. Let him think he had trained her properly. Tomorrow, he would learn exactly how wrong he was. Friday morning arrived with fog so thick it turned the city into a ghost of itself. Serafina barely slept, her mind running through everything that could go wrong. Ashford might refuse to cooperate. Eleanor might lose her nerve and tell Edmund nothing. Damien might somehow discover what she had done. But at noon, when she arrived at Vale House, Nathaniel was there with Lord Edmund Ashford and Eleanor, and the expression on Edmund's face told her everything she needed to know. He looked like a man who had been drowning and had finally been thrown a rope. Your Grace, Edmund said, his voice hoarse. Eleanor says you're offering immunity. Mr. Crowe is offering immunity. I'm just facilitating the conversation. Nathaniel had brought 2 assistants and a court stenographer. The parlor had been transformed into something resembling an interrogation room, though the furniture was too elegant and the tea service too refined for the gravity of what was about to happen. Lord Ashford, Nathaniel began formally, you're here voluntarily to provide testimony regarding a conspiracy to defraud property owners through manipulation of debt and forged legal documents. In exchange for complete cooperation and truthful testimony, the Crown is prepared to offer full immunity from prosecution. Do you understand? I understand. Edmund looked at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. I'll tell you everything. What followed was 4 hours of detailed confession. Edmund Ashford had been recruited 5 years ago when his gambling debts had become unmanageable. Damien had offered to help, for a price. That price had been participation in a scheme to identify vulnerable property owners, manufacture financial crises, and acquire their land through legal manipulation. We targeted families who were land-rich but cash-poor, Edmund said, his voice flat with exhaustion. People who had valuable estates but not enough liquid assets to fight back when creditors came calling. Thornwood would find loopholes in their contracts or property deeds. Carver would use his merchant connections to cut off their income streams. Damien would coordinate everything and then swoop in as the rescuer, offering to buy the land or assume the debts. And the victims? Nathaniel asked. Most of them never knew what hit them. They thought they were just experiencing bad luck, failed investments, unexpected expenses. By the time they realized something was wrong, we'd already taken everything. Serafina listened with growing horror and vindication. This was worse than she had imagined. Not just her family, but dozens of families destroyed systematically over years. How many? She asked quietly. Edmund looked at her. At least 20 families that I know of. Probably more. Damien kept most of the operation compartmentalized, so none of us knew the full scope. And my father specifically? Vale was targeted because of the land. Small estate, but perfectly positioned between two major properties Damien wanted to consolidate. Your father was honest and trusting, which made him easy to manipulate. We manufactured a series of financial pressures until he was desperate enough to accept Damien's offer of marriage. And me? What was I in all this? Edmund had the decency to look ashamed. Collateral, a way to make the acquisition look respectable. Damien never intended to honor the marriage contract. He just needed legal access to the Vale estate. Serafina felt something cold settle in her chest. She had known intellectually that Damien had used her, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She wasn't a person to her husband. She was a legal instrument, a tool for theft. Nathaniel noticed her expression. Your Grace, perhaps you should... I'm fine. Continue. The interrogation went on. Edmund provided names, dates, documents he had kept as insurance. He confessed to forgery, to bribery, to conspiracy. He implicated not just Damien, but Thornwood and Carver and a dozen other nobles and merchants who had participated in the scheme. By the time he finished, the stenographer had filled nearly 40 pages with testimony. This is sufficient for arrest warrants, Nathaniel said finally. Lord Ashford, you and your wife will be taken into protective custody until the trial, for your own safety. Edmund nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and terrified. Eleanor was still crying, but quietly now, the tears of someone who had been holding tension for so long that release felt almost painful. After they left with Nathaniel's assistance, Serafina and Nathaniel were alone in the parlor. The fog outside had thickened, turning the windows into walls of gray nothing. What happens now? Serafina asked. Now I present this evidence to the Crown Prosecutor. Warrants will be issued, probably within 48 hours. Your husband and his associates will be arrested, likely during some public event to prevent them from fleeing or destroying evidence. The royal banquet, Serafina said immediately. 3 days from now, every noble family will be there. Maximum visibility, maximum humiliation. That would be effective? Good. She felt nothing saying it. No satisfaction, no guilt, just cold, purposeful focus. Damien humiliated me publicly for 3 years. Let him experience it once. Nathaniel studied her carefully. You're not having second thoughts? Why would I? Because once this starts, it can't be stopped. Your husband will be arrested. Your marriage will be dissolved. Your name will be attached to one of the largest corruption scandals in a generation. You'll be famous, but not necessarily in a good way. I stopped caring about my reputation when the man I married made it clear I was worthless to him. Serafina stood, gathering her things. I'm not doing this for redemption or vindication. I'm doing this because powerful men who destroy innocent people should face consequences. If my reputation is the price for that, so be it. You've changed completely from the woman I met at the Pemberton ball. No, I'm just finally becoming the woman I should have been all along. The next 2 days were the strangest of Serafina's life. She moved through Blackthorn Manor knowing that everything was about to explode, maintaining perfect composure while internally preparing for war. She attended to household duties with mechanical precision. She spoke to Damien when required, answered his questions with appropriate deference, and gave him no reason whatsoever to suspect what was coming. It was almost too easy. Damien was so convinced of his own superiority, so certain that his decorative wife posed no threat, that he didn't notice the subtle changes. The way Serafina held herself differently now, the way her eyes tracked him with cold calculation rather than hurt disappointment, the way she had stopped flinching when he spoke to her harshly. Saturday evening, Damien informed her they would be attending the royal banquet together. "I need you presentable," he said dismissively. "The Queen will be there, and appearances matter." "Of course," Serafina agreed. "I'll wear the emerald gown." "The blue one. I prefer you in blue." "The blue one, then." She didn't argue. There was no point. In less than 48 hours, Damien's preferences would be completely irrelevant. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about everything that would happen. The arrests, the scandal, the trial that would expose years of corruption and destroy dozens of powerful families. She thought about the victims, 20 families, probably more, who had lost everything while people like her attended parties and pretended not to notice. She thought about her father, who had been targeted and manipulated and driven into desperation, who had married her off to a monster because he had no other choice, who had died 2 years ago never knowing that his careful documentation would eventually bring down the people who destroyed him. Grief and rage twisted together into something that felt almost like purpose. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went down to the library. She pulled out the books her father had loved, histories and philosophies and stories about people who had fought impossible battles. She had spent so much time in this room over the past 3 years, hiding from her husband and her life, losing herself in other people's stories because her own was unbearable. No more hiding, no more losing herself. It was time to write her own ending. Okay. The royal banquet was held in the Grand Palace, a sprawling complex of marble and gold that represented centuries of inherited power. Serafina had been here dozens of times, always as decoration on Damien's arm, always feeling small and insignificant in rooms designed to overwhelm. Tonight felt different. She wore the blue gown Damien had demanded, but she had chosen her mother's diamonds instead of the Ashcroft jewels. A small rebellion, but rebellion nonetheless. Her hair was styled simply, her face composed, her posture perfect. Damien looked at her with vague approval as they prepared to depart. "You look acceptable." "Thank you, darling." The carriage ride to the palace was silent. Serafina watched the city pass by and thought about all the versions of herself that had made this journey before. The naive bride 3 years ago who had believed in fairy tales. The broken wife 2 years ago who had stopped believing in anything. The numb ghost 1 year ago who had stopped feeling altogether. Tonight she was someone new, someone harder, someone capable of destroying the man sitting across from her without hesitation or regret. The palace was overwhelming as always, filled with nobles in their finest clothes, musicians playing perfect background ambiance, servants offering champagne and delicacies to people who had never known hunger. Serafina accepted a glass and sipped slowly, needing to stay completely clear-headed for what was coming. Damien immediately went to find his associates. Serafina watched him cross the room toward where Thornwood and Carver were standing with several other men. They looked confident, secure, completely unaware that Crown investigators were watching from strategic positions around the ballroom. Serafina spotted Nathaniel Crowe near one of the tall windows, dressed in formal clothes that made him look like any other noble. Their eyes met briefly. He gave the smallest nod. Everything was ready. The Queen arrived at 8, accompanied by her advisors and guards. Everyone bowed. The Queen made appropriate remarks about unity and prosperity. The banquet officially began. Serafina moved through the crowd, greeting people she knew, making polite conversation, playing her role one final time. Several people commented that she looked different tonight, more confident, more present. She smiled and thanked them and said nothing of substance. At 9, as dessert was being served, Nathaniel Crowe approached the Queen and spoke quietly with her chief advisor. Serafina watched from across the room as the advisor's expression shifted from polite interest to shocked attention. He gestured to several guards. The room continued its oblivious celebration while the machinery of justice began moving. At 9:15, the Queen's chief advisor stepped onto the raised platform where musicians had been playing. He called for attention. The room gradually quieted, confused about the interruption. "By order of Her Majesty and the Crown Prosecutor," the advisor announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom, Warrants have been issued for the arrest of multiple individuals on charges of conspiracy to defraud, forgery, bribery, and theft of property. The room erupted into shocked whispers. Serafina felt her heart pounding, but kept her face neutral. The advisor continued reading names. Duke Damien Ashcroft, Sir Victor Thornwood, Samuel Carver, Lord... The rest was drowned out by chaos. Guards moved through the crowd toward the named individuals. Damien's face had gone from confident to pale in seconds. He looked around wildly, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. His eyes found Serafina across the room. She saw the exact moment understanding hit him. His expression shifted from panic to rage as he realized who had betrayed him. He started moving toward her, pushing past people, his face twisted with fury. "You!" he snarled when he reached her. "You did this." "I survived this," Serafina corrected quietly. "You did this to yourself." "I'll destroy you." "No, Damien, you already tried that. It's my turn now." Guards grabbed him before he could respond. Sir Victor Thornwood was being restrained nearby, maintaining his composure even as he was being arrested. Samuel Carver had tried to run and had been caught immediately. The entire ballroom was chaos, nobles shouting questions, servants backing against walls, guards moving with grim efficiency. The Queen's advisor approached Serafina. "Your Grace, Her Majesty requests your presence." Serafina followed him through the crowd, aware that every eye in the room was on her now. The Queen sat on a raised chair regarding the chaos with regal disapproval. "Duchess Ashcroft," the Queen said, "I understand you played a significant role in bringing this conspiracy to light." "I provided evidence, Your Majesty. Mr. Crow conducted the investigation. Nevertheless, it took courage to act against your own husband. The Crown is grateful." Serafina curtsied. "I'm grateful for the Crown's protection, Your Majesty." "You'll have it. I'm also prepared to offer the dissolution of your marriage on grounds of fraud and criminal conduct. You'll retain your family property and receive compensation for damages." "Thank you, Your Majesty." The Queen studied her with shrewd eyes. "You look different than I remember. Less fragile." "I was never fragile, Your Majesty. I was just pretending to be." A slight smile touched the Queen's face. "Good. Fragile women don't survive court politics. Come see me next week. I suspect you and I should talk." Serafina was dismissed. She walked back through the ballroom, past clusters of gossiping nobles, past guards escorting prisoners, past servants whispering about the scandal. At the edge of the room, she found Christopher, who looked simultaneously shocked and proud. "Sarah," he said quietly, "did you really?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have tried to stop me, or you would have helped me, and either way you would have been implicated. This way, you're safe." Christopher pulled her into a hug. "You terrify me sometimes." "Good. I'm just starting to terrify myself." Miss Scouts. Nathaniel found her later after the arrests had been completed and most of the guests had fled in shocked confusion. "That went as well as could be expected," he said. "Meaning?" "Meaning we arrested everyone we needed to arrest, secured all the evidence, and avoided any casualties. Your testimony will be required at trial, but the case is solid." "How long until trial?" 3 months, maybe 4. Long enough for the prosecutors to organize everything, short enough that the scandal won't fade. Serafina nodded. "And Damien?" "Imprisoned pending trial. No bail for conspiracy of this magnitude. He'll stay locked up until sentencing." "Good." They stood together in the now mostly empty ballroom, surrounded by the debris of what had been an elegant celebration. Overturned champagne glasses, abandoned plates of food, the detritus of panic. "What will you do now?" Nathaniel asked. "Sleep for approximately 3 days, then figure out how to rebuild my life from the wreckage." "You could leave, start over somewhere else." "No." Serafina's voice was firm. "I'm not running. This is my home, my city, my life. I won't let Damien take that from me too." "Then let me help. You'll need allies." "Why would you help me? Your job is done." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Because I've watched powerful men destroy people my entire career, and I've rarely seen someone fight back the way you did. Because you deserve better than what happened to you. Because," he hesitated, "because I think you're remarkable." Serafina looked at him, surprised. Nathaniel Crowe was not a man who gave compliments easily or expressed emotion casually. The admission hung between them, weighted with possibility and danger. "I don't need rescuing," she said carefully. "I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering partnership." "In what capacity?" "Whatever capacity you want. Friendship, alliance, something more if you're interested." Serafina felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, not the desperate hope of her younger self, but something steadier. Possibility without expectation. Interest without attachment. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said finally. "After the trial, after the scandal settles, when we both know who I actually am outside of this disaster." Nathaniel smiled. "That's fair." He offered his arm. "Can I at least escort you home?" "To Vale House, not Blackthorn Manor. I'm never sleeping in that house again." "To Vale House, then." They walked out together past guards and servants and the last lingering nobles who were trying to process what they had witnessed. Outside, the fog had cleared, leaving the night sharp and cold and full of stars. Serafina looked up at those stars and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of despair. Space where despair had been. Room for something new to grow. The carriage ride to Vale House was quiet. Nathaniel didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless conversation, which Serafina appreciated. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. 3 years of accumulated tension was finally releasing, and she felt hollowed out but also strangely light. When they arrived at Vale House, Mr. Hendricks was waiting with tea and a fire already burning in the parlor. Serafina had sent word earlier that she would be staying here from now on. "Will you come in?" she asked Nathaniel. "I should go. You need rest." "I need a lot of things. Rest is probably the least of them." He smiled slightly. "Then I'll visit tomorrow. We can start planning what comes next." "What comes next is me learning how to exist as myself instead of as someone's wife." "That sounds like a good place to start." He left, and Serafina was alone in her childhood home for the first time since her father had died. She walked through rooms that remembered her, touching furniture that had stories, breathing air that didn't taste like Damien's cruelty. In her father's study, she sat at his desk and pulled out paper. She needed to document everything while it was fresh. The timeline of abuse, the evidence she had gathered, the way it felt to finally fight back after years of submission. She wrote for hours, her hand cramping, her eyes burning, her mind finally processing everything that had happened. When she finally stopped, dawn was breaking outside the windows, turning the sky from black to gray to soft pink. Serafina set down her pen and realized with startling clarity that she had just survived the worst night of her life, and she had done it without breaking, without compromising, without becoming the powerless victim Damien had tried to create. She had become something else entirely, something harder, something dangerous, something free. The clock in the hall struck 6. A new day. The first day of a life that belonged entirely to her. Serafina stood, stretched her aching shoulders, and looked out at the city waking up beneath a sky that promised nothing but gave everything anyway. Whatever came next, scandal, trial, social exile, judgment, she would face it standing upright with her eyes open. Because she had learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival wasn't about enduring quietly until the pain stopped. It was about becoming the kind of person who could endure anything and still choose to keep fighting. And Serafina Vale Ashcroft was done enduring. She was ready to fight. The first week after the arrest felt like living in the eye of a storm. Serafina woke each morning in Vale House, expecting catastrophe and finding only silence. The scandal had erupted exactly as predicted, every newspaper in the city running variations of the same story about corruption, stolen estates, and a duchess who had brought down her own husband. Her name was in every gossip column, every salon conversation, every whispered exchange between servants. She had expected judgment. What she got was something more complicated. Some nobles treated her like a pariah, crossing the street to avoid acknowledging her presence. Others looked at her with barely concealed admiration, as if she had done something they wished they had the courage to attempt. The queen had made her position clear by inviting Serafina to a private audience, which functioned as royal endorsement whether or not the queen intended it that way. Christopher visited daily, alternating between pride in his sister's courage and terror about the consequences. Martha had asked to continue serving as head of household at Vale House, bringing with her 3 other servants from Blackthorn Manor who apparently preferred Serafina's employment to Damien's. Nathaniel came every other day with updates on the investigation and the upcoming trial. Everything was proceeding according to plan. That should have been Serafina's first warning. On the 8th day after the arrest, she received a letter. It arrived with the Morning Post, mixed in with condolence notes from distant relatives and hate mail from strangers who thought wives should remain loyal, regardless of circumstance. The envelope was expensive paper, sealed with wax that bore no identifying mark. Inside was a single page written in elegant script. "Your Grace," it began, "you have made a terrible mistake. The game you think you won is only beginning, and the pieces you thought you controlled were never yours. If you wish to survive what comes next, meet me at the Ivory Club tonight at 9. Come alone, or don't come at all. A friend who knows the price of ambition." Serafina read it 3 times, her hand steady, but her mind racing. The tone was wrong, too familiar, too knowing. This wasn't a threat from one of Damien's allies seeking revenge. This was something else. Someone who understood exactly what she had done and why. She should have shown the letter to Nathaniel immediately, should have let Crown investigators handle whatever this was, should have been cautious. Instead, she found herself obsessing over the phrase, "The pieces you thought you controlled were never yours." What pieces? She had gathered evidence. She had recruited Edmund Ashford. She had coordinated with Nathaniel Crowe. She had orchestrated Damien's arrest at the royal banquet. Every step had been her decision, her plan, her execution. Except, Serafina sat very still as her mind began working backward through everything that had happened. Edmund Ashford had confessed easily, too easily for a man who had spent 5 years participating in criminal conspiracy. Nathaniel Crowe had appeared at the Pemberton ball exactly when she needed an ally, as if he had been waiting for her to approach him. The timing of everything had been almost perfect, too perfect. She thought about her father's documents, how they had been preserved so meticulously when most people would have destroyed evidence of financial embarrassment. She thought about Martha's nephew working at the Ivory Club with access to information about Damien's secret meetings. She thought about how Christopher had visited just before the arrests, asking questions about her plans, pieces on a board. But whose board? Serafina burned the letter immediately, watching the expensive paper curl and blacken in the fireplace. Then she went to her father's study and began pulling out every document again, reading them with new eyes, looking not for evidence of Damien's guilt, but for evidence of her own manipulation. What she found made her blood run cold. Her father's correspondence with creditors showed pressure, yes, but the timing was too coordinated to be natural market forces. Someone with significant resources and detailed knowledge of the Vale family finances had engineered the collapse. That someone could have been Damien, or it could have been someone using Damien as a tool while making him think he was the architect. The marriage contract between Serafina and Damien had been negotiated by Sir Victor Thornwood, who was now under arrest. But reviewing the contract now, Serafina saw clauses that made no sense from Damien's perspective. Protections for her inheritance that should have been removed if his goal was complete control. Provisions that would return the Vale estate to her if the marriage was dissolved due to criminal conduct. Why would Damien agree to terms that undermined his own scheme? Unless he hadn't understood what he was agreeing to. Unless someone had written the contract to look like it favored Damien while actually protecting Serafina. Setting up a situation where, if Damien's crimes were exposed, she would emerge with her inheritance intact and legal grounds to reclaim everything. Serafina felt sick. She had thought she was fighting back against Damien's attempt to destroy her. But what if she had been following a script written by someone else? What if her entire rebellion had been orchestrated by forces she didn't understand? The question was who and why. She thought about the letter's signature. A friend who knows the price of ambition. There was only one person who fit that description and had the resources to manipulate both Damien and Serafina for years without either of them realizing. The Queen. Serafina dressed carefully that evening, choosing dark colors that would blend into shadows. She told Martha she was visiting Christopher and would return late. She left through the servants' entrance and hired a public carriage rather than using her own, giving the driver an address 3 blocks from the Ivory Club. The club itself was in a neighborhood that wealthy men visited but didn't acknowledge visiting. Expensive enough to be exclusive, discreet enough to enable activities that couldn't survive scrutiny. Serafina had never been inside, but she knew its reputation. Private gambling rooms, business conducted away from official channels. The kind of place where power was exercised without witnesses. The doorman looked surprised to see a woman approaching alone, but when Serafina gave her name, his expression shifted to careful neutrality. He had been expecting her. She was escorted through a main room filled with cigar smoke and male laughter, then down a corridor to a private parlor at the back. The door opened and Serafina stepped inside. The queen sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, dressed in traveling clothes rather than royal finery. Without the trappings of court, she looked younger than her 50 years, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Serafina stood frozen in the doorway. Of all the people she had expected to meet, the queen herself had not been on the list. "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into a curtsy. "Close the door, Serafina. Sit down. We need to talk, and we don't have much time." Serafina did as instructed, her mind racing. This meeting was impossible. The queen didn't conduct secret business in gambling clubs. The queen didn't arrange clandestine meetings with minor nobility. The queen especially didn't put herself in compromising positions that could undermine royal authority, unless the situation was desperate enough to justify the risk. "I imagine you have questions," the queen said. "Several thousand," Serafina replied carefully, "starting with why the ruler of the kingdom is meeting me in a place like this. Because this place belongs to me. Not officially, of course. Officially, it's owned by a series of shell companies and managed by men whose loyalty I purchased years ago. But every conversation that happens here, every transaction, every secret shared, all of it flows back to me eventually." Serafina felt her understanding of reality shifting. The Ivory Club wasn't where Damien had conducted his criminal business in secret. It was where he had conducted his criminal business under royal surveillance. "You've been watching him the entire time. I've been watching a lot of people the entire time. Your husband was just one piece of a much larger puzzle." The queen leaned forward slightly. 5 years ago, I began noticing patterns of property consolidation that didn't make economic sense. Estates being acquired at suspicious rates. Families losing land through mechanisms that looked legal but felt wrong. I assigned investigators, but they kept hitting walls. The conspiracy was too well organized, too carefully compartmentalized. So you created a situation that would force it into the open. I created several situations. Most of them failed. You were my last option, and frankly, I wasn't confident you would succeed. The bluntness stung. Serafina kept her voice level. "What do you mean I was an option?" The queen stood, moved to a small table where decanters of liquor waited. She poured 2 glasses of something amber and offered one to Serafina, who took it automatically. "Your father came to me 6 years ago," the queen said. "He was being pressured financially and suspected something coordinated was happening. He couldn't prove it, but he was meticulous enough to document everything. I believed him. I also knew that if I investigated officially, the conspiracy would scatter like rats. I needed someone inside the operation, someone who could gather evidence without raising suspicion. You used my father as bait. I offered your father protection if he would help me expose the people destroying him. He agreed. We planned to let him fall into debt, let the conspirators approach with their rescue offer, and then track everything from there." She paused, and for the first time showed something that might have been regret. "Your father's death from fever wasn't part of the plan. That was just bad luck. But by then you were already married to Damien, and I realized you could still serve the same function." Serafina felt rage building, hot and dangerous. "You manipulated my entire marriage. I created the conditions for your marriage. Damien approached your father thinking he was exploiting a vulnerable family. Your father agreed to the marriage, knowing it would put you in position to eventually gather evidence. I made sure the marriage contract had protections he didn't notice. Then I waited to see if you would be strong enough to use them. And if I wasn't strong enough, then Damien would have divorced you, taken your inheritance through legal loopholes we had deliberately left open, and I would have tried something else." The queen's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing agricultural policy rather than the destruction of Serafina's life. "You were a calculated risk. Most women in your position would have endured quietly until the marriage ended. You surprised me by fighting back. You used me." Serafina's hands were shaking. "You let me suffer for 3 years while you watched and waited to see if I would be useful. Yes. The admission hung between them, brutal and honest. Serafina wanted to scream, wanted to throw her glass against the wall, wanted to hurt this woman who had treated her like a chess piece and called it strategy. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked instead. "Because the game isn't over." The queen returned to her chair. "Damien and his immediate associates are under arrest. But they were middle management, Serafina. The real architect of the conspiracy is someone I haven't been able to identify. Someone who has been using men like your husband as proxies while remaining completely invisible. Someone who saw you take down Damien and is now moving to eliminate you before you can threaten them." The letter was a warning. Someone is going to try to kill you within the next week. I don't know who or how, only that several of my informants have reported unusual activity. Money changing hands, questions being asked about your routine, someone preparing something. Serafina felt cold. "And you're telling me this because I need you alive. You're the only person who has successfully penetrated this conspiracy from the inside. You know things you don't even realize you know. If we can keep you alive long enough to testify at trial, you might inadvertently reveal something that identifies the real architect. So I'm still useful to you." "Exactly." The queen's smile was cold. "I'm not pretending to care about you personally, Serafina. You're a tool I need to use, but I can protect you if you cooperate. Crown Guards. Safe location. Everything you need to survive until trial, and if I refuse, then you'll probably die, and I'll have to find another way to catch whoever's pulling the strings. It will take longer and cost more lives, but I'll manage eventually." The queen finished her drink. "You have a choice. Accept my protection and continue being useful, or try to survive on your own and likely fail." Serafina stood abruptly. "I need air. Take all the air you want, but decide quickly. My guards are outside. If you leave with them, you live. If you leave alone, you take your chances with whoever's hunting you." Idrumbat. Serafina walked out of the parlor in a daze, past the guards who watched her with professional neutrality, through the club's main room where men gambled with money that represented food for families. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, shocking her lungs. She had been used. Her father had been used. Her entire marriage had been a performance in someone else's play. Every moment of suffering, every humiliation, every night she had spent alone in that manor, teaching herself not to feel, all of it had been observed and calculated and deemed acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of political goals. The queen was right that Serafina had a choice, but it wasn't the choice the queen thought. Serafina could accept protection and become a permanent instrument of royal policy. Or she could refuse and face assassination alone. Or she could find a third option that nobody had planned for. She started walking, ignoring the guards who called after her. She needed to think, needed to understand exactly what she was facing before making decisions that couldn't be unmade. The streets were mostly empty, just late-night workers and people conducting business that preferred darkness. Serafina pulled her cloak tighter and kept moving, her mind working through everything the queen had revealed. If there was an architect behind the conspiracy, someone who had been directing operations through proxies, then that person would have detailed knowledge of everyone involved, including Serafina, including what evidence she possessed, including what she had told Nathaniel Crow. Nathaniel. Serafina stopped walking, a terrible suspicion forming. Nathaniel Crow had appeared at the Pemberton ball at exactly the right moment, had said exactly the right things to gain her trust, had guided her investigation in specific directions, had been the one to suggest targeting Edmund Ashford for testimony. What if Nathaniel wasn't a Crown investigator at all? What if he was the architect inserting himself into her rebellion to control what evidence reached the Crown? No. That didn't make sense. Nathaniel had arrested Damien, had presented evidence to prosecutors, had facilitated the entire exposure of the conspiracy, unless exposing the conspiracy had been his goal all along. Burn the middle management to protect himself. Use Serafina to eliminate rivals and witnesses, then kill her before she could testify about anything that might inadvertently expose him. Serafina resumed walking faster now, heading toward Vale House. She needed to check something, needed to verify her suspicion before it consumed her. She was 3 blocks from home when she realized someone was following her. The footsteps were careful, maintaining distance but matching her pace. Serafina turned down a side street, testing. The footsteps followed. She picked up speed. So did her pursuer. She ran. The streets blurred past, her breath coming hard, her dress hampering movement. Behind her, the footsteps accelerated into a sprint. Serafina turned a corner sharply, nearly colliding with a vendor closing his cart. She used the moment of confusion to duck into an alley, pressing herself against the wall in shadows. The footsteps approached, paused. A figure stepped into view at the alley's entrance, silhouetted against streetlight. Not a hired assassin. Someone she recognized. Christopher. Her brother stood at the alley entrance, breathing hard from running. His face was anguished. "Sarah," he called into the darkness. "I know you're here. Please, we need to talk." Serafina stepped out of the shadows, her heart pounding. "Kit, what are you doing? Following you. I've been following you for days." He moved closer, and she could see tears on his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do this, but they have me trapped. They have me completely trapped." "Who has you trapped?" Christopher pulled something from his coat. A knife, small but sharp, the kind gentlemen carried for opening letters. It shook in his hand. "I'm supposed to kill you," he said, his voice breaking. "They said if I don't, they'll expose things about me. Things that would destroy the family name, things that would ruin me." Serafina felt reality fracturing. Her brother, her only remaining family, her protector who had visited constantly to check on her welfare. All of it had been surveillance. "What things?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the terror flooding through her. Christopher was crying openly now. "Debts. Gambling debts worse than Ashford's. I borrowed from dangerous people, Sarah. People connected to the conspiracy. They've been using me to watch you, to report your movements, to gain access to Vale House and read your documents when you weren't home." The night he visited before the arrests, when she had left him alone in the parlor for 10 minutes, when she had returned to find him looking agitated and guilty. He had read her plans, had reported everything to whoever was pulling the strings. "How long?" Serafina demanded. 2 years. Since before Damien started planning your divorce. They approached me after I lost badly at cards. Said they would forgive the debt if I kept them informed about you. I thought it was just information. I didn't know they were planning to hurt you, but you kept reporting anyway. I had no choice. They owned me. They still own me. And now they've said if I don't kill you before you testify, they'll make sure I'm implicated in the conspiracy. They'll claim I was working with Damien. They'll destroy me. So you were going to kill your own sister to save yourself." Christopher looked at the knife in his hand as if surprised to find it there. "I don't want to. I can't. But Sarah, they'll destroy me. Everything Father built, everything our family represents, it will all be gone." Serafina felt something cold and final settling in her chest. This was what power actually looked like. Not Damien's crude domination, not the Queen's calculating manipulation. This. Family turning on family because survival required it, love becoming weapon, trust becoming liability. "Give me the knife, Kit." "No. No, I can't. If I don't, give me the knife or use it. Those are your only options." Christopher stood frozen, the knife shaking so badly it was nearly falling from his grip. Serafina could see him warring with himself, desperation fighting whatever shreds of conscience remained. She made the choice for him. Serafina stepped forward quickly, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the cobblestones. Christopher collapsed against the alley wall, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry. I'm weak. I've always been weak. Father knew it. You knew it. Everyone knew it, except me." Serafina picked up the knife, her hand steady. She looked at her brother, the boy who had broken the vase and let her take the blame. The young man who had believed problems could be solved through direct confrontation. The adult who had crumbled the moment real pressure was applied. She had loved him. Probably still loved him. But love didn't mean trust. Love didn't mean safety. "Who sent you?" she asked. "I don't know. I've never met them. Everything comes through intermediaries. Letters telling me what to report. Money appearing in my account. Instructions delivered by messengers who vanish before I can ask questions." "When were you supposed to report that you killed me?" "Tomorrow morning. They want confirmation before the trial preparation begins." Serafina made a decision that felt like cutting off her own limb. "All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to report that you killed me. You're going to tell them the body is hidden somewhere it won't be found immediately. Then you're going to disappear. What? You're going to leave the city tonight. Go to the countryside. Use a false name. Don't tell me where you're going. If anyone asks, I'll say you fled in shame after being exposed as part of the conspiracy. But I'll be implicated. You already are implicated, Kit. The difference is whether you're alive and hidden or dead in an alley because I couldn't trust you. Choose. Christopher looked at her with devastation. You'd do that? You'd help me escape after I tried to kill you? I'm helping you escape so I never have to wonder if you'll try again. Serafina's voice was cold. You're my brother, and I love you, but I can't protect you anymore. Save yourself or don't. Either way, I'm done carrying your weight. She left him there, still crying against the alley wall, and walked back toward Vale House with the knife in her pocket, and her heart turned to stone. Boom. She didn't go home. Instead, she went to the one place that might still be safe, the palace. The guards at the gates recognized her and sent word inside. Within minutes, she was being escorted to a private sitting room where the queen waited, still dressed in her traveling clothes from their earlier meeting. You didn't take my guards, the queen observed. No, I took a walk instead. Serafina sat down uninvited. Tell me about Nathaniel Crowe. The queen's expression shifted slightly. What about him? Is he actually a Crown investigator? Yes. I've known him for 15 years. He's loyal, competent, and thoroughly vetted. Could he be compromised? Anyone can be compromised given sufficient pressure, but I trust Nathaniel as much as I trust anyone, which admittedly isn't much. The queen studied Serafina's face. What happened? My brother just tried to kill me. He's been reporting on me for 2 years to whoever's running this conspiracy. They sent him to murder me before I could testify. The queen was silent for a moment. Christopher Vale? I had him investigated. He came up clean except for gambling debts, which I deemed insufficient motive for involvement. Gambling debts are exactly sufficient motive for someone desperate and weak. Serafina felt exhausted. Everyone is compromised. Everyone is being used. Everyone is lying. I don't know who to trust anymore. Then don't trust anyone. The queen's voice was matter-of-fact. Trust is luxury. In situations like this, you calculate probabilities and minimize risk. That's a miserable way to live. It's the way people who survive actually live. Trust is what gets you killed. Serafina thought about her father who had trusted the queen to protect him and had died anyway. About her marriage to Damien, which had been built on manipulation disguised as rescue. About Christopher, who she had loved and who had tried to murder her for money. The queen was right. Trust was suicide. I need you to do something, Serafina said. I need you to publicly announce that I've gone into protective custody at an undisclosed location. Make it seem like I'm so frightened of retaliation that I'm hiding. Why? Because I need whoever's hunting me to think they've won, to think I'm neutralized and no longer a threat. Then I need you to give me complete access to everything the Crown has gathered about this conspiracy. Every document, every interview, every piece of evidence, all of it. So you can do what? So I can find whoever's trying to kill me before they succeed. Serafina leaned forward. You said I know things I don't realize I know. You're right, but I can't figure out what those things are while running for my life. Give me protection, give me information, and give me time. I'll find your architect. And if you fail, then I die, and you find another tool to use. But right now, I'm the best option you have. The queen regarded her for a long moment. You've changed even from this morning. You're harder. This morning, I still believe some people were worth saving. Tonight, I learned that everyone saves themselves when the pressure gets high enough. So yes, I'm harder. Good. Soft people don't survive what's coming. The queen stood. You'll stay in the East Wing. It's the most secure location in the palace. I'll have all the conspiracy documents delivered within an hour. You'll have crown guards, though given what happened with your brother, I'm not sure guards actually help. They help as long as I know they're watching me. It's the people I trust who try to kill me. A faint smile crossed the queen's face. You're learning. That's promising. Ulk. The east wing of the palace was less ornate than the staterooms, but infinitely more comfortable. Serafina was given a suite that had apparently belonged to a prince who died 20 years ago, complete with sitting room, bedroom, and a study that would serve her purposes perfectly. The documents arrived in 3 large crates carried by crown officials who looked at her with carefully neutral expressions. Everyone knew who she was now. The Duchess, who betrayed her husband. The woman who had sparked the largest corruption scandal in a generation. The tool the Queen was using to pursue goals that remained conveniently vague. Serafina waited until she was alone, then began unpacking the crates methodically. Trial transcripts from Edmund Ashford's testimony. Financial records seized from Damien's estate. Correspondence between the conspirators. Property records showing decades of suspicious transactions. Witness statements from families who had been destroyed. She worked through the night, building a timeline that spanned not 5 years, but nearly 20. The conspiracy had started small. A few targeted acquisitions, some manipulation of land prices. Over time, it had grown more sophisticated, more organized, more devastating. But there was no central figure visible in the documents. No single name that appeared consistently. Just a pattern of coordinated activity that required someone intelligent and patient pulling strings from behind multiple proxies. Dawn came gray and cold. Serafina had been working for 8 hours straight, and her eyes burned with exhaustion. She was about to force herself to sleep when something clicked. She pulled out the correspondence between Damien and Sir Victor Thornwood, reading more carefully this time. Thornwood's letters were professionally correct, but occasionally included small personal details. References to mutual friends, comments about social events, observations about political maneuvering. Then Serafina noticed something strange. Several of Thornwood's letters referenced a person only as V, as in V suggests we delay the Pemberton acquisition, or V has concerns about the Ashford situation. At first, Serafina had assumed V meant Thornwood himself. His given name was Victor, but reading more carefully, the context didn't fit. Thornwood was writing to Damien about V as a third party, someone whose advice Thornwood valued, someone who had significant influence over the conspiracy's operations. Serafina grabbed different documents, searching for any other reference to V. She found 3 mentions in Edmund Ashford's testimony, references to instructions that came from V, decisions that V had made, concerns that V had raised, 6 mentions in Samuel Carver's financial records, payments made to V, investments coordinated through V, shipments arranged by V. V wasn't a person's name, it was a designation, a placeholder for whoever was running everything. Serafina felt close to something important. She kept reading, kept searching. There had to be a clue. Had to be something that would identify who V actually was. She found it in the most unlikely place. Her father's correspondence. A letter written 6 weeks before his death, addressed to someone whose name had been redacted from the official files. But the letter's content made clear it was to the Queen, reporting on his investigation into the conspiracy. I believe the person coordinating these attacks is someone with significant legal expertise and long-term positioning within the nobility, her father had written. Someone who understands property law intimately and has access to private financial information across multiple families. Someone who has been operating for longer than we initially suspected. Then, at the bottom of the letter, a final line. I suspect V is actually... The sentence ended there. Her father had died before finishing the thought. Serafina stared at the incomplete sentence, frustration mounting. Who had her father suspected? What had he been about to reveal? She thought about people with legal expertise. Thornwood certainly qualified, but he was too visible in the conspiracy to be the architect. Who else? The Queen had legal advisors, crown prosecutors, court officials who handled property disputes and inheritance cases. Serafina froze. Court officials who handled property disputes and inheritance cases. She grabbed the documents related to her own marriage contract, reading through them again with new understanding. The contract had been negotiated by Thornwood and approved by a court official who verified its legal validity. That official's signature was on the final page. Veronica Ashford, Chief Magistrate for Property and Inheritance Law. V. Serafina's hand shook as she pulled out more documents, looking for any mention of Magistrate Ashford. She found dozens. Every suspicious property transfer in the past 20 years had passed through the magistrate's office for legal approval. Every forged document had received an official stamp of validity. Every family that had been destroyed had first navigated a legal system overseen by someone who was actively helping destroy them. And Veronica Ashford was Edmund Ashford's cousin. Family connection explaining why Edmund had been recruited, why he had been useful. Why he knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to identify the real architect. Serafina had found her. She should have felt triumphant, should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt sick, because Veronica Ashford was currently overseeing the legal preparation for the trial that would prosecute Damien and his associates. She had access to all the evidence, all the witness statements, all the prosecution strategy, and she knew exactly what Serafina had testified, knew exactly what evidence existed, knew exactly how to make sure the trial failed or succeeded according to her preferences. The Queen had said Serafina knew things she didn't realize she knew. This was it. During her testimony preparation, she had mentioned something that had triggered Veronica Ashford's concern, something that had made the magistrate decide Serafina was too dangerous to live. Serafina tried to remember every detail of her testimony preparation session with prosecutors. It had been 2 days ago, before the Queen's revelation about the hidden architect. She had been honest and thorough, describing everything she had witnessed, everything she had discovered. What had she said that was different from what everyone already knew? She had mentioned her father's documents, had explained how meticulously he had recorded every transaction, every correspondence, every suspicion. And she had mentioned that those documents were stored at Vale House in her father's study, untouched and complete. Veronica Ashford now knew that evidence existed which could identify her. Evidence that Serafina hadn't yet fully analyzed, but which her father had compiled before his death. Evidence that needed to be destroyed along with the only person who knew where it was. Serafina stood abruptly, her exhaustion forgotten. She needed to get to Vale House immediately, needed to secure those documents before the door to her suite burst open. Not guards, not palace officials. Nathaniel Crowe, breathing hard from running, his face pale with urgency. "Serafina," he said, "you need to come with me right now. Vale House is on fire." They ran through the palace corridors, past startled servants and confused guards. Outside, Nathaniel had a carriage waiting. Serafina threw herself inside, not caring about propriety or appearances. "How bad?" she demanded as the carriage lurched into motion. "Bad. Multiple origins, deliberate arson. The fire brigade is there, but—" Nathaniel's expression was grim. Martha and the other servants made it out. But the study is completely engulfed. Her father's documents. 20 years of carefully compiled evidence. The only comprehensive record of the conspiracy's full scope. All of it burning. Serafina felt something inside her snap. Not break, snap. Like a bone that had been bent too far finally giving way under pressure. She had endured Damien's cruelty, had survived the Queen's manipulation, had been betrayed by her own brother. And now someone had destroyed the only leverage she had, the only proof that could expose the real architect of everything that had ruined her life. When they arrived at Vale House, the fire was visible from 3 blocks away. Flames consumed the upper floors, smoke billowing into the pre-dawn sky. Neighbors stood watching. The fire brigade worked desperately to contain the blaze, and standing at the edge of the crowd, watching with an expression that might have been satisfaction, was a woman Serafina recognized from court functions. Magistrate Veronica Ashford, observing the destruction of evidence that could have convicted her. Serafina got out of the carriage slowly, her movements careful and controlled. Nathaniel called after her, but she ignored him. She walked toward the magistrate with purpose in every step. Veronica Ashford noticed her approaching. For just a moment, genuine surprise crossed her face. Then it smoothed into professional sympathy. "Your Grace, what terrible timing. I was passing nearby and saw the smoke. I'm so sorry for your loss." Serafina stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the magistrate's eyes clearly, close enough to recognize calculation disguised as concern. "You set this fire," Serafina said quietly. "That's a serious accusation." The magistrate's voice remained perfectly calm. "I understand you're distraught, but my father suspected you. He wrote about it in his final letters. He knew someone with legal expertise was coordinating the conspiracy, and he was about to identify you specifically when he died. Your father died of fever. That's a matter of public record. Fever that came very conveniently right before he could expose you." Serafina felt cold clarity settling over her. "You've been running this operation for 20 years, using proxies like my husband to acquire property while you handled the legal manipulation that made it possible. making yourself rich and powerful while destroying families too vulnerable to fight back. You have no proof of any of this. The magistrate's mask was slipping slightly, confidence giving way to caution. And even if you did, you're not exactly a credible witness. Everyone knows you're the queen's tool, saying whatever she tells you to say. I have my father's documents, 20 years of evidence showing patterns you created. Had. Past tense. The magistrate glanced at the burning house, satisfaction returning to her expression. Whatever documents you had are ash now, which means you have nothing but speculation and conspiracy theories from a woman desperate to avoid admitting she married badly. Serafina smiled, and it was the coldest expression she had ever worn. You're right, the documents in the house are ash. But my father was paranoid. He kept copies. The lie came easily, smoothly, born from 3 years of learning that survival required deception. Serafina had no idea if copies existed, but Veronica Ashford didn't know that. The magistrate's expression flickered. You're bluffing. Try me. Let this go to trial. Let me testify about everything I've discovered. Let the Crown prosecutors start investigating you specifically. See what happens. They stood in silence, watching each other like predators sizing up prey. Around them, the fire brigade shouted instructions. Water hissed against flame, and Vale House continued its destruction. Finally, Veronica Ashford spoke, her voice low enough that only Serafina could hear. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This conspiracy goes deeper than you can imagine. People with real power, real resources. If you keep pushing, you won't survive. I've been told I won't survive so many times in the past month that it's lost all meaning. Serafina leaned closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess. You're going to provide evidence about everyone involved. And you're going to do it before I decide to share my father's copies with people who want you dead as much as I do. The magistrate laughed, harsh and bitter. You think you can threaten me? I've been playing this game since before you were born, and I've been learning from the best manipulators in the kingdom for the past 3 years. You taught me well, all of you. Serafina straightened. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I start talking. She turned and walked back to where Nathaniel waited, leaving Veronica Ashford standing alone watching her childhood home burn. Nathaniel studied her face. What did you say to her? That I have copies of my father's evidence, and I'll expose her unless she confesses. Do you actually have copies? No idea. But she doesn't know that. Nathaniel looked impressed and slightly horrified. That's an incredibly dangerous bluff. Everything about my life is dangerous now. At least this way I'm the one creating the danger instead of just surviving it. They stood together watching the flames, and Serafina felt something fundamental shifting inside her. She had spent 3 years being shaped by cruelty and manipulation, had been used by the queen, betrayed by her brother, threatened by conspirators, and nearly destroyed by forces she couldn't control. But she was still standing, still breathing, still capable of threatening the people who had threatened her. She had become exactly what survival required her to become, someone harder than the forces trying to break her. The question now was whether that person could survive what she had become. Serafina didn't sleep. She returned to the palace with Nathaniel and spent what remained of the night sitting in the window of her borrowed suite, watching the city wake up beneath a sky that promised nothing but cold indifference. Her childhood home was ash. Her brother was a coward who had tried to murder her. The documents that might have protected her were destroyed, and she had just threatened one of the most powerful legal officials in the kingdom based on a lie about evidence that probably didn't exist. This was what it felt like to have nothing left to lose. Not freedom, because she had given up autonomy the moment she married Damien. Not safety, because powerful people had been trying to destroy her since before she understood what power actually meant. Not even hope, because hope required believing the future could be better than the present, and Serafina had stopped believing in better futures 3 years ago. What she had instead was something colder and more dangerous than hope. She had purpose. She had rage that had been compressed into diamond-hard focus. She had the knowledge that survival sometimes required becoming the thing you feared most. Ruthless, calculating, willing to burn the entire world down if that's what it took to stay standing. Her father had died trying to expose corruption from within a system designed to protect the corrupt. Serafina was done working within systems. She was going to shatter them. Nathaniel knocked on her door just after dawn. He looked as exhausted as she felt, his usual sharp attention dulled by lack of sleep and the weight of revelations that kept piling up like corpses after a battle. "The Queen wants to see you," he said. "Now." "Good. I want to see her too." They walked through the palace in silence. Servants pressed themselves against walls as Serafina passed, their eyes tracking her with the fascinated horror usually reserved for public executions. She had become notorious overnight. The Duchess, who betrayed her husband, the woman whose home had burned, the tool the Queen was using to pursue a conspiracy that seemed to grow larger and more complicated every time someone looked at it. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Serafina was done caring what people thought about her. The Queen was in her private study, a room Serafina had never been allowed to enter before. It was smaller than expected, almost intimate, with books lining the walls and a desk covered in papers that represented the actual work of governing rather than the performative spectacle of court. "Sit," the Queen said without preamble. "Tell me what you discovered last night." Serafina remained standing. "Magistrate Veronica Ashford is your architect. She's been running the conspiracy for 20 years, using her position to manipulate property law, while proxies like Damien handled the visible criminal activity. My father suspected her before he died. I threatened her last night, and she didn't deny it." "Threatened her with what?" "With evidence I don't actually have. I told her my father kept copies of his documents. She believed me because people with guilty consciences always believe their paranoia is justified." The Queen leaned back in her chair, studying Serafina with an expression that might have been approval or might have been calculation. It was hard to tell with a woman who treated people like chess pieces. That was an enormous risk. "Everything about my life is an enormous risk now. At least this way I control the stakes. You control nothing. You made a desperate bluff based on hope that a career criminal would panic rather than call you on it." The Queen's voice was sharp. "What happens when Magistrate Ashford realizes you have no leverage? When she decides to eliminate you rather than confess? Then you'll have to find another tool to use." Serafina kept her voice level despite the fear crawling up her spine. "But I don't think she'll call my bluff. She destroyed Vale House specifically to eliminate evidence. That means she's afraid of what that evidence contains. Fear makes people stupid. Fear also makes people vicious. I'm counting on it. If she comes after me directly, she exposes herself. If she runs, you can pursue her officially. If she confesses, you get everything you need to dismantle the conspiracy. Every option leads somewhere you can use." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the arm of her chair in a rhythm that sounded like calculations being made. "You've learned faster than I expected. Most people take years to understand power the way you're starting to understand it. Most people don't have their lives systematically destroyed as educational opportunity." "Fair point." The Queen stood, moved to a window that overlooked the palace gardens. "Veronica Ashford is brilliant, patient, and has spent 2 decades building protection around herself. If you're wrong about her panicking, if she's more rational than you're giving her credit for, she'll come at you from directions you can't anticipate. Then help me anticipate them." Serafina moved to stand beside the Queen. "You've been manipulating people for longer than I've been alive. You know how power actually works. Tell me how she'll move." The Queen glanced at her, something that might have been respect flickering across her face. "She'll try to isolate you, cut you off from allies, from protection, from anyone who might believe your accusations. She'll plant doubt about your credibility. You're already compromised as the scorned wife seeking revenge. She'll use the legal system she controls to create procedural barriers. And if all else fails, she'll arrange an accident that looks plausible enough that no one investigates too carefully. So I need to force her hand before she can do any of that. How do you plan to force the hand of someone who controls the legal framework for the entire kingdom?" Serafina smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. "By doing what she won't expect, by being too chaotic to predict, by breaking all the rules she's been using to protect herself." The Queen turned to face her fully. "What are you planning? Something stupid and desperate that will either expose her completely or get me killed?" "Probably both." The trial of Duke Damien Ashcroft and his co-conspirators was scheduled to begin in 3 days. It was supposed to be the culmination of months of investigation, a public demonstration that the crown would not tolerate corruption among the nobility, a warning to anyone else who thought they could manipulate the system for personal gain. Instead, Serafina was going to turn it into an execution. Not Damien's execution, though that would come eventually, through legal channels that would satisfy the Queen's need for order. Veronica Ashford's execution, professional, social, legal. The complete destruction of a woman who had spent 20 years thinking she was untouchable. The plan was insane. It relied on assumptions that might be wrong, bluffs that might be called, and cooperation from people who had no reason to help her. But insanity was all Serafina had left, so she was going to use it with surgical precision. She spent the next 2 days preparing. Nathaniel helped despite his obvious concern that she was spiraling into something she couldn't control. The Queen provided resources while maintaining plausible deniability about what those resources would be used for. And Serafina herself worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood this was her only chance. If this failed, Veronica Ashford would destroy her. If it succeeded, Serafina would destroy an entire system that had allowed monsters to hide behind legal authority for decades. Either way, the old world was ending. The question was what would replace it. The morning of the trial arrived cold and bright, the kind of weather that made everything look clean and promising despite the rot underneath. Serafina dressed carefully in a gown of severe black wool, her hair pulled back in a style that made her look older and harder than her 26 years. She wore no jewelry except her mother's pearls, the only thing she owned that represented love rather than transaction. Nathaniel arrived to escort her to the courthouse. He looked at her outfit and frowned. "You're not testifying today. Opening statements only, no witnesses until tomorrow. I know, but I'm going to be visible. I'm going to sit in the gallery where everyone can see me, and I'm going to make sure Magistrate Ashford knows I'm watching her." That's provocative. That's the point. The courthouse was a grand building designed to inspire respect for justice and intimidate anyone who thought about challenging authority. Serafina had been here once before, years ago, for a property dispute involving her father's estate. She remembered being overwhelmed by the marble columns, the formal procedures, the sense that ordinary people had no power in a space built to enforce rules they didn't create. Today the courthouse was packed. Every noble family in the city had sent representatives. Journalists crowded the press gallery. Common citizens lined up for the public seating area, hoping to witness the spectacle of powerful people being held accountable for once. Serafina entered through a side door reserved for witnesses and crown officials. Nathaniel led her to a seat in the gallery that had perfect sight lines to both the prosecution and defense tables. She sat down, arranged her skirts, and looked directly at where Magistrate Veronica Ashford sat among the prosecution team. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Ashford's expression remained professionally neutral, but Serafina saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes. The magistrate was worried. Good. The trial began with formal procedures, announcing the charges, swearing in the jury, establishing the rules that would govern the proceedings. Serafina barely listened. She was watching Magistrate Ashford, cataloging every small reaction, every moment of tension. Then the Crown Prosecutor stood to deliver opening statements. He was a middle-aged man with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never lost a case that mattered politically. He outlined the charges against Damien and his associates with clinical precision: conspiracy to defraud, forgery, bribery, theft through legal manipulation. As the prosecutor spoke, Serafina watched Veronica Ashford's face. The magistrate was listening intently, occasionally making notes. To anyone else, she looked like a dedicated legal official supporting the prosecution. But Serafina saw the calculation behind those notes. Ashford was identifying weaknesses in the case, planning defensive strategies, preparing to sabotage the prosecution from within. Damien sat at the defense table looking furious and trapped. Sir Victor Thornwood maintained aristocratic composure. Samuel Carver looked resigned to whatever fate awaited him. And Edmund Ashford, who had confessed everything in exchange for immunity, sat separately as a crown witness, his face gray with the knowledge that his testimony would destroy people he had worked with for years. The defense counsel stood for his opening statement. He argued that the accused men were victims of overreach by Crown investigators desperate to justify their existence, that the evidence was circumstantial, that testimony from admitted criminals like Edmund Ashford couldn't be trusted, that this was a witch hunt designed to satisfy public demands for accountability rather than actual justice. It was a competent defense, but doomed. The Crown had too much evidence, too many witnesses, too many documented crimes. Damien and his associates were going to be convicted, unless someone sabotaged the prosecution from inside. After the opening statements concluded, The judge, a stern man in his 60s who looked like he had never smiled in his life, announced that the first witness would testify tomorrow morning. The court was adjourned until then. Serafina stood, making sure she moved slowly enough that Magistrate Ashford would have time to notice her leaving. As she reached the door, she glanced back. Ashford was watching her with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been hostility. Tomorrow would reveal which. Much. That night, Serafina couldn't eat. She sat in her borrowed palace suite pushing food around a plate while her mind raced through everything that could go wrong. Nathaniel had tried to convince her to postpone, to gather more evidence before making her move. The Queen had warned her that attacking a sitting magistrate without absolute proof would backfire catastrophically. Serafina knew they were right. She was also out of options and out of time. Around midnight, someone knocked on her door. Soft, hesitant, the kind of knock that suggested the person on the other side didn't actually want to be there. Serafina opened it to find Eleanor Ashford, Edmund's wife, looking terrified and determined in equal measure. "Your Grace?" Eleanor said quietly. "May I come in?" Serafina stepped aside, gesturing her inside. Eleanor entered like someone expecting to be attacked, her movement small and defensive. "My husband told me what you're planning to do tomorrow," Eleanor said once the door was closed. "He says you're going to accuse Magistrate Ashford publicly during the trial. Your husband talks too much. He's terrified. We're both terrified. Veronica Ashford is family. If you destroy her, Edmund loses the immunity deal. They'll prosecute him as a co-conspirator." Serafina poured 2 glasses of wine and offered one to Eleanor, who took it with shaking hands. "Your husband participated in a conspiracy that destroyed 20 families. He helped steal estates, forge documents, and ruin innocent people. The fact that he confessed doesn't erase what he did." "I know." Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "I know he's guilty. I know he deserves punishment, but he's trying to do the right thing now. He's testifying, he's helping, because he had no other choice. Because I backed him into a corner where confession was his only option." Serafina sat down across from Eleanor. "Don't mistake survival instinct for morality. Then what do you call what you're doing?" Eleanor met her eyes directly. "You're not pursuing justice. You're pursuing revenge. You want to hurt everyone who hurt you, regardless of whether it actually makes anything better." The accusation stung because it was partially true. Serafina did want revenge. She wanted to watch Veronica Ashford suffer the way she had suffered, wanted to destroy the woman who had orchestrated her father's financial ruin and her own miserable marriage, wanted blood and tears and the satisfaction of seeing power torn away from someone who had abused it for decades. But revenge wasn't the only thing driving her. There was something else underneath the rage, something that felt almost like purpose. "I'm pursuing accountability," Serafina said quietly. "I'm making sure that people who destroyed families for profit face consequences. If that looks like revenge, it's only because justice and revenge become the same thing when the legal system is too corrupt to deliver either." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Then what happens to people like Edmund? People who were used by Veronica Ashford but weren't the architects? Do they deserve destruction too? They deserve whatever punishment fits their actions. Your husband helped ruin families. He should face consequences. But I'm not targeting him. I'm targeting the person who created the system he operated within. And if destroying that system destroys innocent people caught in the collapse?" Serafina thought about her father, who had been innocent and had been destroyed anyway. About the 20 families who had lost everything because they were vulnerable and someone powerful decided that vulnerability was opportunity. About the countless others who would be destroyed in the future if people like Veronica Ashford continued operating without consequence. "Then those innocent people will understand what every victim of this conspiracy already understands," Serafina said flatly. "That power protects itself, and the rest of us are just acceptable losses." Eleanor left shortly after, her face pale with the knowledge that nothing she said would change what was coming. Serafina locked the door behind her and returned to the window, watching darkness cover the city like a shroud. Tomorrow she would either expose decades of corruption or be destroyed trying. There was no middle ground anymore, no compromise, no safe option that protected everyone. She had become exactly what survival required, someone willing to sacrifice anything, including herself, to make sure the people who had destroyed her didn't get to keep destroying others. Whether that made her a hero or a monster would depend entirely on who was left standing when the smoke cleared. The second day of the trial began with Edmund Ashford taking the witness stand. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight, his face drawn and gray, his hands trembling as he swore to tell the truth. The Crown prosecutor led him through testimony that was damning and detailed. Names, dates, amounts stolen, families destroyed. Serafina watched from the gallery as Damien's expression went from fury to resignation. Her husband had relied on Edmund's silence, on the assumption that loyalty or fear would keep his associate from confessing. Instead, Edmund was systematically dismantling every defense, exposing every crime, leaving no room for doubt about what they had done. But Serafina wasn't watching Edmund. She was watching Magistrate Veronica Ashford, who sat at the prosecution table making careful notes. To everyone else, it looked like a dedicated official documenting testimony. To Serafina, it looked like someone cataloging weaknesses, identifying areas where Edmund's testimony could be attacked, preparing to undermine the case from within. The morning session ended with Edmund still on the stand, exhausted from hours of questioning. The judge called for a lunch recess. People filed out of the courtroom in clusters, gossiping about what they had heard, speculating about what would come next. Serafina didn't leave. She sat in the gallery watching as the room emptied, waiting for the moment she needed. Magistrate Ashford was the last to leave the prosecution table, gathering her notes with methodical care. As she turned toward the exit, she saw Serafina still sitting there. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the empty courtroom. Then Serafina stood and walked down to where the magistrate stood. "You're sabotaging the prosecution," Serafina said quietly. "You're going to find procedural errors or evidentiary problems that will get the case dismissed or the convictions overturned. You're going to protect yourself by destroying the trial from inside." Veronica Ashford's expression remained professionally neutral. "That's quite an accusation. Do you have any evidence?" "Not yet, but I will. And when I do, I'm going to destroy you the same way you destroyed my father. Your father destroyed himself through poor financial decisions. I simply handled the legal proceedings that resulted. You manufactured those financial decisions. You coordinated the pressure that drove him into debt. You used your position to make sure he had no legal recourse." Serafina stepped closer. "And you did it all from behind layers of proxies and legal cover so you could claim innocence while people like Damien took the fall. Prove it." The challenge hung between them, sharp and dangerous. Serafina felt her heart pounding but kept her voice steady. "I don't need to prove it. I just need to make you afraid that I can. And you are afraid. That's why you burned Vale House. That's why you're here personally overseeing this trial instead of delegating to subordinates. You're terrified that somehow, somewhere, there's evidence you didn't destroy." Magistrate Ashford smiled coldly. "You're bluffing. You have nothing. You're a desperate woman whose life is falling apart, trying to feel powerful by making accusations you can't support." "Maybe." Serafina smiled back, matching the magistrate's coldness. "But here's what I know about powerful people who've never been challenged. When someone finally calls their bluff, they panic. And panic makes people sloppy." She turned and walked away, leaving Veronica Ashford standing alone in the empty courtroom. Serafina's hands were shaking, but she didn't let it show until she was outside, around the corner, out of sight. Nathaniel was waiting for her. "Did you do what I think you just did?" I provoked her. "Now we wait to see how she responds. This is insane. You're gambling your life on psychological manipulation." "I'm gambling my life because I don't have any other options." Serafina leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. "Either this works, and she exposes herself, or it doesn't, and I'm dead. But at least I'll die knowing I tried." The afternoon session was supposed to continue Edmund Ashford's testimony. Instead, 10 minutes before court was scheduled to resume, the Crown prosecutor approached the judge with an urgent motion. Serafina watched from the gallery as they conferred in whispers, the prosecutor looking frustrated and confused. The judge banged his gavel. "Due to procedural concerns raised by the magistrate's office, we will take an extended recess while the prosecution reviews certain evidentiary matters. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gallery erupted in confused murmuring. This wasn't how trials were supposed to proceed. Cases this important didn't get delayed for vague procedural concerns. Something was wrong. Serafina felt cold certainty settling over her. Magistrate Ashford was making her move. creating legal barriers that would slow or stop the prosecution, using her authority to inject doubt and confusion into proceedings that should have been straightforward. It was exactly what Serafina had predicted. It was also exactly what she needed. She found Nathaniel outside the courtroom looking furious. The magistrate just submitted a formal objection to Edmund Ashford's testimony. She's claiming there are irregularities in how his immunity deal was structured. She's saying his confession was coerced and shouldn't be admissible. Can she do that? She's the chief magistrate for property and inheritance law. She has significant authority over legal proceedings related to property crimes. If she pushes hard enough, she can create enough procedural chaos to derail the entire trial. Perfect. Nathaniel looked at her like she had lost her mind. Perfect? Serafina, she's destroying the case against your husband and his co-conspirators. No, she's exposing herself. Serafina felt a fierce satisfaction building. She's using her official authority to interfere with a crown prosecution. That's not just suspicious, it's evidence of corruption. She's doing exactly what I hoped she would do, acting out of fear instead of calculation. You hoped she would sabotage a trial that's supposed to bring your husband to justice? I hoped she would give me proof that she's the architect, and she just did. Hulk. That evening, Serafina requested an emergency audience with the Queen. She was granted it immediately, which suggested the Queen had been expecting this. They met in the same small study where Serafina had first revealed Magistrate Ashford's identity. The Queen looked tired, which was unusual for a woman who normally projected absolute control. I've had 3 different officials tell me that Magistrate Ashford is interfering with the Ashcroft trial, the Queen said, without preamble. They're all confused because she's supposed to be supporting the prosecution, not undermining it. She's protecting herself. Serafina sat down uninvited. She knows the trial might expose her, so she's trying to destroy it from within. She's using her authority to create procedural barriers that will either get the case dismissed or make successful prosecution impossible. That's a serious abuse of power. That's provable corruption. Serafina leaned forward. She's not hiding behind proxies anymore. She's acting directly, using her official position to obstruct justice. If you investigate her now, you'll find evidence of the interference. You can use that as grounds to remove her from office and launch a full investigation into her activities. Removing a sitting magistrate requires extensive documentation and multiple levels of approval. It could take months, then bypass the process. You're the Queen. You have authority that supersedes procedural requirements when national security is at stake. This isn't a national security matter. A 20-year conspiracy involving stolen estates, forged legal documents, and systematic corruption within the legal system? Serafina kept her voice hard. If that's not a national security matter, what is? The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming that calculating rhythm on her chair. You want me to remove Magistrate Ashford immediately, without following proper procedure, based on interference you deliberately provoked? Yes. That sets a dangerous precedent. It suggests the Crown can remove officials without due process, whenever it's politically convenient. The magistrate has been operating without due process for 20 years. She's destroyed families, stolen estates, and manipulated the legal system for personal profit. Due process is a luxury she stopped deserving when she started betraying the system she was supposed to protect. The Queen stood, moved to the window. The same window where she had looked out while explaining that Serafina's father had been bait, that Serafina herself had been a calculated risk, that trust was a luxury people in power couldn't afford. If I do this, the Queen said slowly, I'll be making an enemy of everyone who values procedural protection over pragmatic necessity. Every official who worries they could be next. Every noble who thinks their position should shield them from immediate consequences. Good. Let them be afraid. Let them understand that power requires accountability. Serafina stood as well, moving to face the Queen directly. You've spent years manipulating people to expose this conspiracy. Don't lose your nerve now that you're finally close to destroying it completely. Their eyes met, and Serafina saw something she hadn't expected. Respect. Real respect, not the calculated approval the Queen had shown when Serafina proved useful. You've changed completely from the woman I first put in position 3 years ago, the Queen said. You were supposed to be a passive information source. Instead, you became something far more dangerous. I became what I needed to become to survive. Serafina kept her voice steady. Now help me finish this, or watch me do it alone. Duchess. The queen moved faster than Serafina had anticipated. By midnight, royal guards had surrounded Magistrate Ashford's residence. By dawn, the magistrate was in Crown custody, her office sealed, her papers seized for investigation. And by the time the trial was supposed to resume, the entire legal community was in chaos. Serafina arrived at the courthouse to find journalists swarming the entrance, nobles arguing in the halls, and officials rushing between rooms trying to understand what was happening. The removal of a sitting magistrate without formal charges or procedural review was unprecedented. It was also deeply controversial. Some people saw it as necessary action against obvious corruption. Others saw it as tyrannical overreach by a queen who had decided due process was optional when it suited her political goals. Serafina didn't care what people thought. She cared that Veronica Ashford was in custody and the trial could proceed without sabotage. The judge called the court to order with visible strain. He announced that new prosecutors had been assigned to replace the magistrate's office in supporting the Crown's case. He explained that there would be a brief delay while they reviewed the evidence and prepared to continue Edmund Ashford's testimony. Then he looked directly at Serafina in the gallery. Her Grace the Duchess of Ashcroft has been summoned to testify this afternoon. We will take a short recess to allow the prosecution to prepare their examination. Serafina felt her heart rate spike. She hadn't been scheduled to testify yet. The prosecution had planned to build their case through other witnesses first, establishing the conspiracy's scope before bringing her in to testify about Damien's specific crimes. But with Magistrate Ashford in custody and the case in chaos, someone had decided to accelerate everything. Nathaniel found her in a side room where witnesses waited before being called. You don't have to do this now. The new prosecutors need more time to coordinate. You could request a delay. No. Serafina's voice was firm, despite the fear flooding through her. If I wait, Ashford's allies will have time to organize a defense. If I testify now, while everything is chaos, I can say things that would normally be objected to before anyone realizes what I'm revealing. You want to testify about Magistrate Ashford during a trial that's supposed to be about your husband. I want to testify about the entire conspiracy, about who created it, who ran it, who profited from it, about the 20 years of systematic corruption that destroyed my father and dozens of other families. Serafina stood, straightening her dress. Damien is just one piece. Today I'm going to expose all of it. That could get you killed. I've been hearing that threat for weeks. At this point, I'm starting to think death would be less exhausting than constantly expecting it. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that might have been admiration or might have been grief for the person she used to be. Promise me something. What? Promise me that when this is over, you'll remember you're still human, that you're not just a weapon pointed at people who hurt you. Serafina thought about the question. She had spent 3 years being broken down into nothing, then weeks rebuilding herself into something harder, something capable of surviving forces that would have destroyed the naive girl who had married Damien Ashcroft. Was she still human, or had she become something else entirely? I'll try, she said finally. That's all I can promise. The courtroom was packed when Serafina took the witness stand. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, journalists leaning forward with notebooks ready. And sitting in the gallery where Serafina had sat just yesterday, watching everything with cold calculation, was the Queen herself. This was theater. Public demonstration that the Crown took corruption seriously. Warning to anyone else who thought they could manipulate the system without consequence. Serafina was the star of this particular performance, whether she wanted to be or not. The new lead prosecutor was a woman in her 40s with shrewd eyes and a reputation for dismantling defendants through methodical questioning. She approached the witness stand with careful precision. Your Grace, please state your relationship to the defendant Duke Damien Ashcroft. I'm his wife. Serafina kept her voice steady. Or I was his wife. I don't know what I am now. How long were you married to the defendant? 3 years. 3 years of learning that marriage can be a prison when one party has all the power and the other has none. The prosecutor nodded. Can you describe the circumstances that led to your marriage? And so Serafina began. She told the court about her father's sudden financial collapse, about Damien's offer to assume the debts in exchange for marriage, about the wedding that had felt like rescue and turned out to be acquisition, about 3 years of isolation and humiliation and teaching herself not to feel because feeling hurt too much. The gallery was silent. Even the journalists had stopped writing, caught up in testimony that was supposed to be about financial crimes but had become something rawer. "When did you first suspect your husband was involved in criminal activity?" the prosecutor asked. "When I found documents showing he planned to divorce me and seize my inheritance through legal manipulation. That's when I understood I hadn't been a wife. I'd been a stepping stone to property he wanted." "What did you do when you discovered this?" I fought back. Serafina looked directly at Damien, who sat at the defense table looking furious. "For 3 years, I had accepted everything he did to me because I thought enduring quietly was what survival required. Then I learned he planned to take the last thing I had left. So I stopped enduring and started destroying." She told them about gathering evidence, about meeting Nathaniel Crowe, about recruiting Edmund Ashford's testimony, about coordinating with the Crown to expose the conspiracy. And then she told them about Magistrate Veronica Ashford. The prosecutor tried to object, claiming it was beyond the scope of the current trial. But Serafina kept talking, her voice rising over the objections. "My father suspected Magistrate Ashford was coordinating the conspiracy years before he died. He documented her involvement in manipulating property transfers. He traced the legal mechanisms that made the entire operation possible, and he was going to expose her when he died of a fever that came very conveniently right before he could testify." "Your Grace," the judge interrupted, "this testimony is not relevant to the charges against the defendant." "It's absolutely relevant." Serafina turned to face the judge directly. "My husband is guilty of the crimes he's charged with, but he's guilty because someone created a system that made those crimes possible, someone with legal expertise and institutional authority. Someone who has been running this operation for 20 years, while people like Damien took the public blame." The courtroom erupted. Defense counsel was shouting objections. The prosecutor looked torn between supporting Serafina's testimony and trying to keep the trial focused. Journalists were scribbling frantically, and the judge was banging his gavel demanding order. Through the chaos, Serafina saw the Queen watching her with an expression that might have been approval. This was the moment. Everything she had fought for, everything she had risked, all of it coming down to whether she could force the truth into the open before someone stopped her. "I have copies of my father's documents," Serafina said clearly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Documents proving Magistrate Ashford's involvement in this conspiracy. Documents showing 20 years of coordinated theft hidden behind legal manipulation. And I'm willing to testify about all of it right now if this court will let me." It was a lie. She had no copies. Vale House had burned and the originals with it. But the lie bought her time, bought her attention, bought her the possibility that someone would investigate before discovering the truth. The judge looked at the Queen, who gave the slightest nod. Then he turned back to Serafina. "The witness will continue. All objections are noted but overruled. This court will hear what Her Grace has to say." And so Serafina talked. She told them everything she had learned, everything she suspected, everything her father had documented about how Magistrate Ashford had used her position to facilitate decades of theft. She named names. She described mechanisms. She painted a picture of systemic corruption that went far beyond one duke's criminal ambition. By the time she finished, it was late afternoon and the courtroom was silent with the weight of revelations that would reshape the kingdom's understanding of justice and power. The prosecutor had no more questions. The defense counsel attempted cross-examination, but Serafina deflected every attempt to undermine her credibility. And when she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she saw Damien looking at her with something that might have been fear, or might have been recognition that the decorative wife he had ignored had become the instrument of his complete destruction. Washik. Serafina walked out of the courthouse into cold evening air and realized she was shaking. Not from fear, from the relief of finally releasing everything she had been carrying. The secrets, the rage, the determination to make sure her suffering meant something. Nathaniel was waiting outside with crown guards positioned protectively around the area. "Your testimony just changed everything." "I know. Magistrate Ashford will be formally charged tonight. The Queen is already coordinating a comprehensive investigation. And your husband's trial is going to expand into something much larger." Good. They stood together in the cold, watching the city prepare for night. Somewhere in that city, families were living normal lives, unaware that the legal system protecting them had been corrupt for decades. Somewhere, children were growing up trusting that power would protect rather than exploit them. Somewhere, people still believed in justice. Serafina had stopped believing in justice years ago, But maybe, just maybe, she had helped create the conditions for it to exist again. Do you think she'll retaliate? Nathaniel asked quietly. Ashford. She still has allies, people who benefited from the system she created. Probably. Serafina felt tired down to her bones. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. Whatever comes next, I'll face it standing up. You've become someone I barely recognize. I've become someone I barely recognize too. Whether that's good or bad, I honestly don't know. They returned to the palace in protected carriages. Serafina was escorted back to her borrowed suite. Guards were posted outside. Every precaution taken to ensure her safety. But safety was an illusion. Serafina knew that now. She had learned it from her marriage, from the Queen's manipulation, from her brother's betrayal. Safety was something people pretended existed to make the world feel less terrifying. What actually existed was power and consequences, and the willingness to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. Around midnight, someone knocked on her door. Not the hesitant knock of Eleanor Ashford seeking mercy, not Nathaniel checking on her welfare. This knock was authoritative, demanding, the kind that suggested the person on the other side wouldn't take no for an answer. Serafina opened the door to find the Queen standing there alone, without guards or attendants. Your Majesty. Serafina stepped back, surprised. The Queen entered, and for the first time since Serafina had known her, the ruler of the kingdom looked uncertain. May I sit? Of course. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the Queen spoke, her voice quieter than Serafina had ever heard it. I owe you an apology. Serafina felt shock run through her. The Queen didn't apologize. The Queen didn't admit error. The Queen was supposed to be above such human weaknesses as regret. Your father came to me for help and I used him as bait. Then he died. And I used you the same way. I told myself it was necessary. That exposing corruption required sacrifices. That individual suffering was acceptable if it served the greater good. The Queen looked directly at Serafina. I was wrong. What I did to you and your father was cruel and manipulative and unforgivable. Serafina didn't know what to say. She had expected many things from this night, but genuine remorse from the Queen wasn't one of them. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to hear it. And because I've spent 30 years believing that power requires sacrificing people for political necessity. Watching you these past weeks has shown me that sometimes the people we sacrifice become more powerful than the goals we sacrifice them for. I'm not powerful. I'm just someone who refused to stay broken. That's exactly what power looks like. The Queen stood, moved to the window. Real power isn't about controlling others. It's about refusing to be controlled. You've learned that faster than anyone I've known. They stood together looking out at the dark city, and Serafina felt something shifting. Not forgiveness. The Queen didn't deserve forgiveness for what she had done. But understanding, maybe. Recognition that they were both women trying to survive in a world designed to destroy them unless they became harder than the forces trying to break them. What happens now? Serafina asked. Now Magistrate Ashford stands trial. Now we investigate everyone connected to the conspiracy. Now we rebuild a legal system that was corrupt for so long most people forgot it could be different. The Queen glanced at her. And you get to decide what kind of person you become after all this is over. What do you mean? You've spent 3 years being shaped by cruelty. You've become hard and calculating and dangerous. Those qualities helped you survive, but they'll destroy you if you let them define you permanently. The Queen's voice was gentle. You have to decide whether you're someone who fights back or someone who fights forward. Whether you're defined by what hurt you or by what you choose to build after the hurting stops. Serafina thought about the question. She had spent weeks focused entirely on exposing corruption, destroying her enemies, making sure people who hurt her faced consequences. But what came after consequences? What did she want beyond revenge? She didn't know. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead because thinking beyond survival felt like tempting fate. I don't know how to build, she said quietly. I only know how to tear down. Then learn. You're young. You're intelligent. You've proven you can navigate systems others find impenetrable. Use those skills to create something instead of just destroying things. The Queen left shortly after, and Serafina was alone with thoughts that felt heavier than any testimony she had given in court. She had won. Damien was going to be convicted. Magistrate Ashford was in custody. The conspiracy was exposed. Everything she had fought for over the past weeks had succeeded. So why did victory feel so hollow? Because revenge didn't heal wounds, she realized. It just made them official. Public acknowledgement that yes, terrible things had happened, and yes, the people responsible would face consequences. But that acknowledgement didn't undo the damage, didn't restore her father's life, didn't give her back the 3 years she had lost to a marriage built on manipulation. Victory meant the fighting was over. It didn't mean the hurting stopped. Serafina sat by the window watching night slowly give way to dawn, wondering what kind of person she was supposed to become now that survival no longer required becoming a weapon pointed at everyone who had hurt her. The answer didn't come. But as gray light crept across the city, she felt something that might have been possibilities stirring beneath the exhaustion. Maybe she would learn to build. Maybe she would become someone defined by what she created rather than what she destroyed. Or maybe she would discover that some things, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt. That some transformations were permanent and irreversible, and turning survivors into something other than human was just another cost of fighting back. The trial would continue. Magistrate Ashford would confess or be convicted based on evidence Serafina's testimony had prompted investigators to seek. The conspiracy would be dismantled. Justice, that strange concept Serafina had stopped believing in, would theoretically be served, and she would have to figure out how to live in the aftermath. The sun rose over a city that looked exactly the same, despite everything that had changed beneath its surface. Serafina watched light replace darkness and understood with brutal clarity that this quiet moment alone with uncertainty about what came next, this was the real ending. Not dramatic confrontation or courtroom revelation, just the slow realization that victory didn't solve everything, and surviving didn't mean healing, and sometimes the hardest part of fighting back was learning how to stop fighting when the enemies were finally gone. A knock at the door. Nathaniel's voice calling her name. The world continuing regardless of whether she was ready for it. Serafina stood, straightened her dress, and made a choice. She would face whatever came next the same way she had faced everything else, standing upright, with her eyes open, refusing to let anyone make her small again. Whether that made her strong or just stubborn, she would discover in time. Nathaniel stood in his doorway, looking at Serafina with concern etched across his face, like something carved by years of witnessing human suffering. The morning light behind him turned him into a silhouette, edges blurred by exhaustion and the weight of revelations that had reshaped the kingdom's understanding of justice overnight. "The Queen wants to see you," he said. "Magistrate Ashford is asking to speak with you directly. She says she'll confess everything if you agree to hear what she has to say." Serafina felt something cold and final settling in her chest. This was it. The moment when everything she had fought for would either crystallize into something meaningful or dissolve into hollow satisfaction that changed nothing. When? Now. She's being held in a private room at the courthouse. The Queen thinks you should go, but she won't force you. She says you've earned the right to refuse. The choice hung there between them. Serafina could refuse and let the legal system grind forward without her participation. Could let prosecutors extract confessions and judges deliver sentences and never have to face the woman who had orchestrated her father's destruction and her own miserable marriage. Could walk away from all of it and start building whatever life waited on the other side of revenge. Or she could face Veronica Ashford one final time and hear whatever truth the magistrate thought was worth confessing. The decision should have been easy. Serafina had spent weeks fighting to expose corruption, to hold powerful people accountable, to make sure her suffering served some purpose beyond just being suffered. Walking away now felt like abandoning everything she had fought for. But another part of her, the part that was so exhausted it could barely stand, the part that had been shaped by cruelty into something harder than human, that part wanted nothing more than to never see Veronica Ashford again. Wanted to let the woman rot in whatever cell they had put her in and never spend another moment thinking about the conspiracy that had consumed her life. "Tell the Queen I'll go," Serafina said finally, "but only if I can speak to her alone. No guards listening, no prosecutors taking notes, just the two of us. That's dangerous. Everything about my life is dangerous. This won't be any worse than what I've already survived." Mauka. The courthouse was quieter than it had been during the trial. Most of the journalists and curious nobles had dispersed after yesterday's explosive testimony. What remained were officials conducting the grim business of processing confessions and coordinating investigations that would take months to complete. Serafina was escorted to a small room in the back of the building, the kind of space where witnesses waited or defendants met with counsel. It was furnished simply with a table, 2 chairs, and a single window that looked out on a courtyard where nothing grew except weeds pushing through cracks in cobblestones. Magistrate Veronica Ashford sat at the table looking diminished in a way that should have been satisfying but somehow wasn't. Without her formal robes and official authority, she was just a woman in her 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. Someone who had built an entire identity around power and was now facing the reality of having that identity stripped away. "Your Grace," Ashford said as Serafina entered. "Thank you for coming." Serafina sat across from her, maintaining distance. "Don't thank me. I'm not here as a courtesy. I'm here because I want to understand why someone would spend 20 years destroying families for profit." Ashford was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table in a gesture that might have been prayer, if prayer meant anything to someone who had made a career out of corrupting justice. When she spoke, her voice carried the flatness of someone who had stopped pretending. "I started because I was angry. 23 years ago, my husband died, leaving me with nothing. He had gambled away everything we owned, and the laws that were supposed to protect widows didn't apply because of technicalities I didn't understand. I lost my home, my status, everything. And I realized the legal system I had trusted was designed to protect men while leaving women like me vulnerable. So you decided to corrupt that system instead of reforming it. I decided to use it the way men had been using it for centuries, for personal gain. I spent years learning property law, finding loopholes, building connections. I became invaluable to people who needed legal expertise for activities that couldn't survive scrutiny. And eventually I realized I didn't need to work for corrupt men. I could run my own operation and use them as proxies." "How many families did you destroy?" Ashford looked down at her hands. 43 that I planned directly. Probably twice that many if you count the operations I facilitated for others. 147 people displaced, 22 deaths that were indirectly my responsibility, people who couldn't survive losing everything. She recited the numbers with the precision of someone who had kept careful accounting. Not out of guilt. Serafina could see no remorse in her expression, but out of the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her conspiracy successful for 2 decades. "And my father?" Serafina kept her voice level, despite rage building beneath the surface. "What made him a target? Location. His estate bordered 2 properties I was consolidating for a client. I needed Vale House to complete the transaction, so I engineered his financial collapse and used Duke Ashcroft as the mechanism for acquisition. Your father was collateral damage in a real estate deal. The casual dismissal of her father's life as collateral damage should have made Serafina scream, should have made her violent. Instead, she felt something colder than rage settling over her. The kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding exactly what you're dealing with. You destroyed my father for a real estate deal. You manipulated me into a marriage that was essentially theft with legal cover. You spent 20 years ruining people because you were angry about your own circumstances." Serafina leaned forward. "And now you want what? Forgiveness? Understanding? Some acknowledgement that your suffering justified what you did?" "No." Ashford met her eyes directly. "I want you to understand that I'm not sorry. I did what I needed to do to survive in a world that would have left me destitute otherwise. If I hadn't used the system to protect myself, I would have been destroyed by it. Just like you would have been destroyed if you hadn't fought back against your husband." The comparison was obscene. Serafina felt fury rising hot and sharp. "I fought back against someone actively trying to destroy me. You preemptively destroyed innocent people to prevent something that might happen. Those are not equivalent, aren't they? You manipulated witnesses, lied to investigators, threatened people who got in your way. You became exactly what you needed to become to survive. The only difference between us is that I had 20 years to perfect the process, and you compressed it into a few weeks." The words hit harder than Serafina wanted to admit. She had become ruthless in pursuit of survival, had manipulated Edmund Ashford into confessing, had provoked Veronica Ashford deliberately to force her into making mistakes, had used people as tools and justified it as necessary for exposing corruption. Was she really any different from the woman sitting across from her? Or had survival simply turned them both into versions of the same thing, people willing to destroy others to protect themselves? The difference, Serafina said slowly, is that I fought back against people who hurt me first. You hurt people who had done nothing to you except exist in locations you wanted to acquire. Intent matters. Motivation matters. Self-defense isn't the same as predation. Tell yourself whatever story helps you sleep, Ashford said. But 20 years from now, when you're looking back at everything you did to survive, you might realize the line between self-defense and predation isn't as clear as you think. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, birds called to each other with sounds that suggested life continued regardless of human tragedy. The world didn't stop for confessions or revelations, or the grinding work of justice trying to catch up with decades of corruption. "Why did you ask to see me?" Serafina asked finally. "If you're not sorry and you don't want forgiveness, what was the point of this conversation? Because you deserve to know the truth." Ashford's expression softened slightly. "Your father was a good man. He suspected what was happening and tried to stop it. I respected that even as I destroyed him. And you? You fought back harder than anyone I've encountered in 20 years. You're brilliant and vicious, and you're going to spend the rest of your life wondering if becoming that way was worth what you had to sacrifice." "What did I sacrifice? Your innocence, your trust, your ability to see people as anything other than potential threats or tools. Those things don't come back once you've trained yourself to live without them." Ashford stood slowly, her chains rattling. "I spent 20 years believing that survival justified anything, that protecting myself mattered more than the people I hurt. And now I'm going to spend whatever time I have left in prison understanding that I was wrong. Not because what I did was immoral. Morality is just a story we tell ourselves about behavior we can't rationally justify. But because I created a world where someone like you had to become someone like me just to survive in it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll confess everything. I'll provide documentation for every crime I committed or facilitated. I'll help dismantle the system I built. Not because I'm seeking redemption, but because watching you fight back showed me something I'd forgotten. That sometimes the cost of survival is higher than the cost of surrendering, and I'm tired of paying it." The guard outside opened the door, and Veronica Ashford was led away. Serafina sat alone in the small room watching dust motes drift through sunlight and trying to process what had just happened. She had wanted confession, had wanted acknowledgement, had wanted the woman who destroyed her father to face consequences and admit wrongdoing. She had gotten all of that. What she hadn't expected was the mirror Ashford had held up showing Serafina exactly what she had become in pursuit of survival. The ruthlessness, the calculation, the willingness to manipulate and destroy when necessary. Was that who she was now? Permanently changed by forces that had shaped her into something harder than human? Or could she still find her way back to being someone who trusted, who hoped, who believed people could be more than their worst actions? The question felt heavier than any testimony she had given in court. The trial concluded 3 weeks later with convictions for everyone involved. Damien received 15 years for conspiracy, fraud, and theft. Sir Victor Thornwood received 12 years. Samuel Carver received 10. Edmund Ashford, in exchange for his testimony and cooperation, received 5 years with possibility of early release. And Veronica Ashford, after providing comprehensive documentation of 20 years of criminal activity, received 25 years without possibility of parole. The sentences were announced in the same grand courthouse where Serafina had testified. She attended the final proceedings sitting in the gallery beside Nathaniel, watching justice try to balance equations that couldn't actually be balanced. "How did you measure the appropriate punishment for destroying 43 families? How did you quantify the damage done by systematic corruption of legal systems people needed to trust? You couldn't. You just decided that some number of years in prison represented accountability and hoped that it would deter future corruption, even though history suggested it wouldn't." After the sentencing, Serafina stood on the courthouse steps watching nobles and officials and journalists disperse into a city that looked exactly the same despite everything that had changed beneath its surface. Someone touched her arm gently. She turned to find the queen standing beside her, dressed in traveling clothes rather than royal finery. "Walk with me," the queen said. They walked through streets that were busy with people conducting ordinary business, buying bread, haggling with vendors, living lives that continued regardless of courtroom drama or political upheaval. The anonymity of it was strange after weeks of being scrutinized constantly. I'm establishing a commission to review property transfers and inheritance cases from the past 25 years, the Queen said as they walked, looking for other victims of Ashford's conspiracy. We'll restore stolen property where possible and provide compensation where restoration isn't feasible. That will take years, probably decades, but it's necessary work. The Queen glanced at her. I want you to lead it. Serafina stopped walking, surprised. Why me? Because you understand what it feels like to be one of the victims. Because you have the intelligence and determination to navigate complex legal cases. Because you've proven you can fight bureaucracy and win. The Queen's expression was serious. And because I think you need purpose beyond revenge if you're going to avoid becoming exactly what you fought against. The offer hung between them, heavy with implications. Leading a commission meant staying involved in politics, meant spending years doing the unglamorous work of investigating old cases and fighting battles against people who would resist reform, meant making enemies and facing opposition and never fully escaping the system that had destroyed her father and nearly destroyed her. It also meant using everything she had learned to help people who were still suffering, meant turning her hard-earned understanding of corruption into tools for dismantling it, meant finding purpose beyond just surviving. I'll do it, Serafina said, on one condition.